I watched the police snap handcuffs around my 10-year-old son's wrists while my own mother stood there smirking. "That destructive brat deserves it, get him out of here," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. My younger sister Vanessa was crying the kind of theatrical tears she'd perfected since childhood, telling the officers how my dangerous child had threatened her family. Complete lies. Every single word. As they pushed Michael into the back of that squad car, his terrified eyes locked with mine through the window, and something inside me broke. But not in the way they expected. See, my family had always seen me as the quiet one, the forgettable daughter, the struggling single mom barely keeping it together. They had no idea who I really was or what I was capable of. What they didn't know, I'm the woman corporations pay 6 figures to uncover lies, trace money trails, and dismantle fraud so complex that lawyers spend years trying to understand it. I make my living finding what people desperately want to hide. And my sister, with her smug professional credentials and our mother backing every move, had just handed me a paper trail. They thought they were teaching me a lesson. They thought they could use the system to put me in my place. They thought I'd just take it the way I always had. They were wrong. By the time I was finished, my sister would lose everything she'd built her identity on. My mother would watch her precious reputation crumble in the same community she'd ruled for decades. And the truth would be undeniable. This is the story of how they tried to destroy my son, and how I methodically dismantled their entire lives in return. Stay with me. You won't believe where this goes. My name is Rebecca Walsh. I'm 35 years old, and for the past 8 years I've made a quiet living as a forensic compliance consultant, helping corporations trace fraud and uncover the lies people bury in spreadsheets and email trails. Most people who know me casually would never guess that I live modestly dressed simply and keep my professional life separate from my personal one, especially when it comes to my family. The evening it all fell apart. Started like every third Thursday of the month for the past 2 years. Dinner at my mother's house. I pulled into the familiar driveway just after 6, the autumn sun already sinking behind the neat row of houses in my mother's subdivision. Michael sat in the back seat, his backpack between his feet, staring out the window with that careful expression I'd come to recognize. He was 10 years old and already learning to armor himself before walking through his grandmother's door. "Ready, sweetheart?" I asked, meeting his eyes in the rearview mirror. He nodded, but his jaw was tight. "Do I have to sit with the cousins?" "Just for a little while," I said, trying to sound encouraging. "If it gets uncomfortable, you can come find me." Carol's house looked exactly as it always did. Perfectly maintained lawn seasonal wreath on the door, everything calibrated to project the image of a woman who had her life together. My mother had spent decades building that image, and I'd spent just as long understanding that I didn't fit into it. I was the older daughter who'd gotten pregnant young, never married the father, and now scraped by as a single mother. At least that's what she believed. That's what I let her believe. The dinner table was already set when we arrived. The good china laid out like this was some kind of special occasion rather than our monthly obligation. My mother greeted us at the door with the same cool smile she always wore when looking at me, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. She bent down to Michael with considerably more warmth. "There's my handsome grandson," she cooed, though even her affection for him felt performative, something she could show off to the other family members who were already gathering in the living room. "Hi, Grandma Carol," Michael said politely, because I'd taught him manners, even if my mother thought I'd taught him nothing of value. The first hour passed in the usual uncomfortable rhythm. My aunt and uncle were there along with my cousin and his wife. Everyone made small talk carefully, avoiding any topic that might require them to ask me directly about my life. I'd learned long ago that in my family being invisible was easier than being scrutinized. Then Vanessa arrived. My younger sister swept through the door 30 minutes late, and somehow that was charming rather than rude. She'd always had that gift. At 32, Vanessa had built exactly the kind of life my mother approved of, married to a decent man. 2 daughters in private school, and a respectable career as a school counselor. She was the golden child, and she wore that crown with the confidence of someone who'd never had to question whether she was loved. But something was off tonight. Her makeup looked hastily reapplied, slightly smudged at the corners of her eyes, and there was a tightness around her mouth that I recognized from our childhood, the expression she wore when she was planning something. "Sorry I'm late," she said breathlessly, kissing our mother's cheek. "It's just been such a difficult week at work. The children we see now, the behavioral issues are just heartbreaking." She settled into the chair across from me, and I felt the shift in the room's energy like a pressure change before a storm. As plates were passed and conversations resumed, Vanessa kept returning to the same theme. "The challenging cases are the hardest," she said, accepting the salad bowl from our aunt. "Especially when you can see the warning signs early but the parents are in denial." My mother nodded gravely. "It takes a trained professional to recognize these things." "Exactly," Vanessa agreed. She glanced at Michael, who was quietly eating his dinner at the kids' table in the corner. "Some children just need more structure than others, more discipline." The comment hung in the air, seemingly casual but weighted with implication. I felt my spine stiffen, but said nothing. This was how it always worked in our family. Vanessa could throw these little grenades, and I was expected to absorb the blast without responding. As the meal progressed, the comments became less subtle. Vanessa mentioned how difficult it must be to manage a child alone, especially a boy who clearly needed a father figure. She brought up an incident from 3 weeks ago when Michael had accidentally knocked over a glass of juice at a family picnic, describing it now as if it had been some kind of violent outburst. "And he yelled at Emma," Vanessa added, referring to her older daughter. "Right in her face. It frightened her." I remembered that moment differently. Michael had raised his voice, yes, after Emma had spent 20 minutes mocking him for not having a father. But correcting Vanessa's version of events would only make me look defensive, so I bit my tongue. Carol joined in seamlessly, as she always did when Vanessa set the stage. "Rebecca never did learn proper discipline," my mother said, as if I weren't sitting right there. "She was always too soft, too permissive." Around the table, my aunt and uncle exchanged uncomfortable glances but said nothing. "In our family, you didn't challenge Carol or Vanessa. You just let them perform." Then Vanessa leaned forward, her voice dropping to something that sounded like concern but felt like calculation. "I noticed Michael asking about the medication in your purse earlier, Rebecca. You do keep that locked up at home, don't you? Children can be so curious about pills." It was Tylenol. Regular over-the-counter Tylenol that I'd taken for a headache before we'd arrived. But the way Vanessa said it made it sound dangerous, irresponsible. "Of course," I said quietly, feeling the familiar burn of humiliation that came from being questioned like a child in front of my extended family. I should have seen it then. I should have recognized that this wasn't the usual pattern of subtle put-downs and passive-aggressive commentary. This was different, more focused, more deliberate. But I was so conditioned to accept my role as the family disappointment that I missed the signs. We were just finishing dessert when the doorbell rang. My mother stood looking genuinely surprised and walked to the door. Through the archway, I could see her expression change from confusion to something else. Something almost like satisfaction as she opened it to reveal 2 police officers standing on her porch. "We received a call about a child welfare concern at this address," one of them said. And that's when Vanessa's face crumpled into tears so sudden and theatrical that if I hadn't known her my entire life, I might have believed them. "Oh, thank God you're here," she sobbed, standing so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. "I didn't want to call, but I had to. He threatened my children. He tried to get into the medications. I'm a mandated reporter. I had no choice." The words came out in a rushing torrent perfectly crafted to hit every trigger point that would make the officers take her seriously. Michael's name. The word threatened. The mention of medications. Her professional credentials. I was on my feet, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about? Michael didn't..." but Carol was already moving to stand beside Vanessa, her hand on my sister's shoulder, in a gesture of support that she'd never once offered me. "I've been concerned, too," my mother said, her voice steady and grave. "Rebecca doesn't have control over that boy. He's been showing concerning behaviors for months." "That's not true," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears, drowned out by Vanessa's continued sobbing and Carol's calm, authoritative tone. The officers looked uncomfortable but resolute. They had a job to do, a protocol to follow, and my sister had just given them all the right keywords. One of them walked toward the kids' table where Michael sat frozen, his fork still in his hand, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Son, we need you to come with us," the officer said, not unkindly but firmly. "Mom?" Michael's voice cracked, and in that moment I saw my 10-year-old boy look at me with an expression that would haunt me for months. Betrayal that I wasn't protecting him. Terror at what was happening, confusion about why his family would do this to him. I moved toward him, but the second officer stepped between us. "Ma'am, please step back." "He didn't do anything wrong," I said, hearing the desperation creeping into my voice. "This is a misunderstanding, my sister is lying." But they weren't listening to me. They were listening to Vanessa, the credentialed professional with tears streaming down her face, and to Carol, the respectable grandmother who'd lived in this community for 30 years. The first officer pulled Michael gently but firmly from his chair, and then, following whatever protocol they'd been trained to follow when dealing with a dangerous child, he took out handcuffs. "No," I breathed, moving forward again. "Please, he's 10 years old, he's not—" The metal clicked around my son's small wrists, and Michael started to cry, not the angry tears of a tantrum, but the broken, terrified sobs of a child who doesn't understand what he did wrong or why the world has suddenly turned against him. "Mom!" he cried out, trying to turn toward me even as the officer guided him toward the door. "Mom, I didn't do anything, I promise I didn't." I tried to follow, but the second officer physically blocked my path. "Ma'am, you need to remain here. Someone from Child Protective Services will contact you." Through the chaos, through my own rising panic and Michael's sobs, I heard my mother's voice, cold and clear and utterly final. "That destructive brat deserves it. Get him out of here." The room fell silent except for Michael's crying. My aunt had her hand over her mouth. My uncle was staring at his plate. Vanessa had stopped sobbing and was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. And in that crystalline moment of horror, as they led my handcuffed child out of my mother's house and into the back of a police car, I understood something fundamental. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't a concerned sister making a difficult call. This was planned, orchestrated, executed with precision. They had set a trap, and I had walked right into it. As the squad car door slammed shut on my sobbing 10-year-old, I realized they weren't just taking my son, they were testing exactly how far I'd let them go this time. I followed the police car to the station in my own vehicle, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. Through the rear window of the squad car ahead of me, I could see the back of Michael's head, small and still, in a way that told me he'd stopped crying and moved into that terrible frozen shock that children go into when the world stops making sense. The police station was a low brick building on the east side of town, the kind of utilitarian government architecture that seemed designed to strip away dignity before you even walked through the door. I parked and rushed inside, expecting to find someone who would listen, someone who would understand that this was all a terrible mistake. Instead, I found myself directed to a plastic chair in a waiting area that smelled of industrial cleaner and burnt coffee. An officer behind a plexiglass partition told me someone would speak with me shortly, his tone suggesting I should be grateful for even that courtesy. I waited. And waited. The clock on the wall ticked past 7:30, then 8. Other people came and went, a woman bailing out her boyfriend, a lawyer in an expensive suit, a teenager with a bloody nose accompanied by his angry father. All of them were attended to before me. When an officer finally called my name, I stood so quickly I nearly knocked over the chair. He led me down a hallway into a small interview room with gray walls and a metal table. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly, washed-out glow. "Have a seat, Ms. Walsh," he said, not meeting my eyes as he consulted a clipboard. "Where's my son? Is he okay? Can I see him?" "We'll get to that. I need to ask you some questions first." The questions came rapid fire, each one designed to paint me as the problem. How many hours a week did I work? Who watched Michael when I was working? Had there been any behavioral issues at school? Any complaints from teachers? Had I ever lost my temper with him? Had I sought anger management counseling? What about the medication he'd allegedly tried to access? Why was I carrying prescription drugs in my purse where a child could reach them? "It was Tylenol," I said, hearing the defensive edge creeping into my voice and hating myself for it. "Over-the-counter Tylenol for a headache. There were no prescription drugs." The officer made a note without acknowledging my answer. "And the incident where your son threatened his cousins? That didn't happen. My sister is... There's history between us. This is personal, not..." "So you're saying your sister, who is a mandated reporter and school counselor, filed a false report?" The way he said it made it sound absurd, like I was the one being unreasonable. I could feel the conversation slipping away from me, each of my explanations twisted into something that sounded like excuse-making. "We have to take mandated reporter claims seriously, ma'am," he said. And there it was, the phrase that gave Vanessa's lies institutional weight. Her professional title was armor. My truth was just noise. I'd been sitting in that room for 20 minutes when a woman in business casual attire entered, introducing herself as Patricia Morton from Child Protective Services. She had a warm smile that didn't reach her eyes and carried a leather folder that she placed precisely in the center of the table. "I know this is stressful," she began, her tone conveying practiced sympathy. "But I need to ask some follow-up questions. This is just routine procedure to ensure Michael's safety." But nothing about her questions felt routine. They felt surgical, designed to expose every vulnerability in my life and turn it into evidence of unfitness. "Who watched Michael when I worked?" "A retired neighbor." "Mrs. Chen usually, though. Sometimes he went to after-school programs." "How many hours a week did I work?" "It varied. I worked from home mostly, but sometimes 40 hours, sometimes more when deadlines hit." "Did I have family support?" I hesitated, thinking of the people who'd just watched my son get handcuffed without saying a word. "Limited," I finally said. "Had there been any previous CPS contact?" "No. Any mental health concerns?" "I'd seen a therapist briefly after my divorce 5 years ago. Any history of substance abuse?" "Number financial stability." We were fine. I made decent money, though. I kept my voice vague because I'd learned never to discuss my actual income with my family. Patricia Morton wrote everything down in neat, precise handwriting. Each answer I gave seemed to slot into some predetermined narrative she was building. When I mentioned working from home with flexible hours, she wrote something and underlined it. When I said limited family support, she made another note. The therapy I'd sought after my divorce, a responsible choice to process grief and adjust to single parenthood, was recorded as if it were evidence of instability. "And Michael's behavioral issues at school," she said, looking up from her notes. "Can you tell me about those? He doesn't have behavioral issues?" I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they sounded defensive. "He's a good kid. He struggles sometimes with focus like a lot of 10-year-olds, but his teachers have never..." So there have been concerns about his focus and attention. I felt like I was drowning, each answer pulling me deeper underwater. She was taking normal childhood challenges and reframing them as red flags. After 45 minutes of this interrogation, I couldn't take it anymore. "Please," I said, my voice cracking. "I just need to see my son. I need to know he's okay." Patricia Morton closed her folder. "I'll see what I can arrange." An officer led me down another hallway to a room with a window that looked into what appeared to be a youth holding area. And there was Michael sitting on a plastic chair that was too big for him, his hands now uncuffed but still red where the metal had been. He was staring at the floor, his shoulders hunched inward in a posture of defeat that no 10-year-old should ever have to learn. Michael, I called out, pressing my hand against the glass. He looked up, and when he saw me, his face crumpled. He stood and moved toward the window, and I could see his mouth forming the word Mom, even though I couldn't hear him through the barrier. I reached for the door handle, desperate to get to him, to hold him, to tell him this would be okay, even though I wasn't sure it would be. The officer's hand clamped down on my wrist. "Ma'am, you can't go in there." "He's my son," I said, trying to pull away. "I have a right to—" "Ma'am, I need you to step back." But I couldn't step back. Michael was right there, 5 feet away, crying behind a window, and I couldn't reach him. I pulled harder against the officer's grip, and suddenly there were 2 officers, and my arms were being wrenched behind my back, and I felt the cold metal of handcuffs closing around my own wrists. "For your safety and ours," one of them said, as if this were reasonable, as if handcuffing a mother trying to reach her child was protocol. They walked me back to the interview room, and I sat there in handcuffs for 10 minutes that felt like hours before they finally removed them. My wrists ached. My whole body ached. But worse than any physical discomfort was the realization of what had just happened. Both my son and I had now been handcuffed in the same night, treated like criminals, our bond reduced to a threat that needed to be managed. Patricia Morton returned, settling back into her chair with that same neutral expression. "Ms. Walsh, I understand you're upset, but that kind of behavior is concerning. It suggests difficulty with emotional regulation and respect for authority." I wanted to scream that they'd just handcuffed a mother for trying to comfort her terrified child, but I knew that any emotional response would only be used against me. So I sat there silent, feeling the trap closing tighter. "I need to be honest with you," Patricia said, her voice still maintaining that false gentleness. "Based on what I've seen tonight and the information in the report, I have concerns about Michael returning to your home this evening. You should prepare yourself in case he doesn't go home with you tonight." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not, "There are some questions to resolve," or, "We'll need to investigate further." She was telling me they might take my son. Tonight. Right now. I looked at her across that metal table, at her professional blazer and her folder full of notes that twisted my life into a story of instability, and something fundamental shifted inside me. I'd spent my entire life being the quiet one, the one who absorbed the blows and kept the peace, the one who made herself small so others could feel big. I'd begged for scraps of approval from my mother and sister, accepting their version of who I was, because fighting back seemed harder than compliance. But they'd crossed a line I hadn't even known existed until they'd stepped over it. They'd put their hands on my child. When the CPS worker calmly hinted my son might not be coming home, something deep inside me stopped begging and started planning. Sitting in that sterile interview room, watching Patricia Morton gather her folder and leave me alone with my thoughts, I felt a familiar sensation wash over me, the feeling of being fundamentally unseen, of speaking words that somehow never reached the ears of the people who were supposed to hear them. It was a feeling I'd known my entire life. I closed my eyes, and I was 8 years old again, standing in the kitchen of the house where I grew up. My mother was at the stove cooking dinner, and I was setting the table 5 places instead of 4, because my father would be home from work soon. Vanessa, who was barely 5 years old, then sat in the living room watching cartoons, her laugh echoing through the house. I'd already helped her get dressed that morning, made her breakfast, and cleaned up the mess she'd made with her crayons. "Good job with the table, Rebecca," my mother said absently, not looking up from the pot she was stirring. It was the kind of praise that felt more like acknowledgement of task completion than genuine appreciation. I'd learned to recognize the difference early. When Vanessa wandered into the kitchen holding up a piece of paper with rough crayon scribbles that vaguely resembled a house, my mother's entire demeanor transformed. She dried her hands on a dish towel and knelt down, taking the drawing with both hands as if it were precious. "Oh, sweetheart, this is beautiful. Look at the windows you drew. You're so artistic." She held the paper up to the light, examining it with exaggerated wonder. "We need to put this on the refrigerator right away. This is gallery-worthy." I watched as my mother used a magnet to display Vanessa's scribbles in the center of the refrigerator door, pushing aside the report card I'd brought home the previous week, all A's, which had earned me a distracted, "That's nice, honey," before my mother returned to whatever she'd been doing. Rebecca's just naturally capable. I heard my mother tell my aunt on the phone later that evening, she doesn't need all the attention and encouragement, but Vanessa is more sensitive, more creative. She needs nurturing. I was in the hallway carrying a basket of laundry to my room, laundry I'd folded myself, because it was one of my regular chores, and I stopped to listen, trying to understand what made me less deserving of nurturing than my little sister. The pattern continued for years. I made honor roll every semester through elementary school, and each report card was greeted with a brief nod of approval before being filed away. Vanessa brought home a gold star sticker from her kindergarten teacher, and my mother called 3 relatives to share the news. I cleaned my room without being asked. Vanessa picked up 3 toys and received effusive praise for being such a good helper. I learned quickly that achievement was expected of me, not celebrated. That competence was my baseline, not my accomplishment. And most importantly, I learned that complaining about this disparity or showing any hurt feelings was selfish and attention-seeking the worst things a child in our family could be. So I became smaller, quieter. I developed an instinct for reading my mother's moods and adjusting my own behavior to avoid friction. I packed my own lunches, did my homework at the kitchen table in silence, and made sure Vanessa had everything she needed for school before worrying about myself. It was easier than fighting for recognition that would never come. The memory that crystallized everything happened in the spring of my 8th grade year. I'd been working with the Academic Challenge Team, a group of students who competed in regional competitions testing knowledge across various subjects. We'd been practicing for months, staying after school twice a week, studying during lunch breaks. When our team won the regional championship, it felt like the first thing I'd done that might actually make my mother proud, not just because it was expected, but because it was exceptional. The ceremony was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the high school auditorium. The principal had sent home invitations for parents 2 weeks in advance. I gave mine to my mother with my heart racing, hoping this would be different, that this achievement was big enough to matter. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she said, glancing at the invitation. "I'll check the calendar." But when Thursday came, I found her in Vanessa's room pinning my sister's hair up in an elaborate style I'd never seen before. "The church is doing a small talent show this weekend," my mother explained, not meeting my eyes in the mirror. "Vanessa is going to sing. We need to practice her outfit and make sure everything is perfect." "But the ceremony is tonight," I said, my voice small. "The invitation said 6 o'clock. My mother's hands paused in Vanessa's hair for just a moment. "Rebecca, you know I can't be in 2 places at once. Vanessa needs help with this. It's her first time performing in front of people. You're getting an award because you're smart. You don't need me there to tell you that." I found my father in the garage, organizing tools that didn't need organizing. He always retreated to the garage when my mother was focused on Vanessa. "Dad," I started, "could you maybe come to the ceremony? Just you if Mom can't make it." He didn't look up from the wrench he was examining. "Your mother's already stressed about Vanessa's performance. You know how she gets." "But it's important to me," I said. And even as a 13-year-old, I could hear how pathetic that sounded, begging for the bare minimum of parental support. "Don't upset your mother," he said finally, meeting my eyes with an expression that I'd come to know well, a mixture of guilt and helplessness that always preceded his emotional retreat. "She's doing her best. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." That evening, I sat in the auditorium surrounded by families. Other students had parents, grandparents, siblings filling the rows. Some had made signs. One girl's father had brought a professional camera. When they called my name and I walked across the stage to receive the award, I looked out at the audience and found the 2 empty seats where my parents should have been. The principal shook my hand and handed me the certificate. People clapped. I smiled because that's what you were supposed to do. And then I sat back down and listened to 19 other names being called, watching 19 other students beam as their families cheered. I took the bus home because my parents had the car at Vanessa's rehearsal. When I walked through the door at 8:30, I found my entire family in the living room watching a video my father had taken of Vanessa singing Tomorrow from Annie. She'd forgotten half the words and gone off key twice, but you'd have thought she'd performed at Carnegie Hall based on my mother's reaction. "There she is," my mother exclaimed when I appeared in the doorway, but she was pointing at Vanessa on the television screen, not at me. "Watch this part, she does this little hand gesture that's just adorable." I stood there holding my award certificate, waiting for someone to ask how the ceremony went. Waiting for someone to notice I'd come home. Waiting for someone to care. No one did. I went to my room and put the certificate in my desk drawer under some old notebooks where it wouldn't remind me of this evening every time I saw it. I never framed it. My mother never asked to see it. It was never mentioned again. That night, lying in bed and listening to my parents tuck Vanessa in with elaborate bedtime stories and songs, I understood something fundamental about my place in this family. My worth was measured in my usefulness and my absence of needs. The less space I took up, the less attention I required, the less I asked for the better daughter I was. My father had taught me that keeping peace meant swallowing hurt. My mother had taught me that love was a finite resource already fully allocated to my sister, and together they'd taught me that my feelings were less important than everyone else's comfort, that my pain was inconvenient, that the role I was meant to play was the one in the background. I learned my lines. I played my part. And by the time I left for college at 18, I already knew the rule in my family: there was room for only one golden child, and it was never going to be me. The truth I learned in that childhood became the blueprint for how I built my adult life. When I became pregnant with Michael at 27, fresh from a relationship that hadn't survived the stress of impending parenthood, I made a conscious choice about what my family would be allowed to see. I bought a small rental house in a modest neighborhood on the north side of town, 3 bedrooms, older appliances, nothing that would draw attention or invite questions about how I could afford it. The house was structurally sound and in a good school district, but it looked like exactly what my family expected the struggling single mother making do with whatever she could manage. My car was a 7-year-old Honda Accord, reliable but unremarkable, with enough wear on the exterior that nobody would wonder why I didn't upgrade. I dressed in clothes from Target and Old Navy, kept my hair in a simple style I could maintain. Myself wore minimal makeup. To my neighbors, I was probably just another work-from-home mom juggling childcare and deadlines. To my family, I was proof that I'd never quite figured out how to build a successful life. The illusion was deliberate and carefully maintained. I'd learned at 8 years old that success in our family wasn't celebrated, it was resented, or worse, exploited. When I was 16 and got my first job at a local bookstore, my mother had immediately started calculating how much I could contribute to household expenses, which really meant funding Vanessa's dance classes and new wardrobe. When I earned a partial scholarship to college, my mother complained to relatives that I was abandoning the family, instead of going to community college and living at home where I could help with Vanessa. So when I started actually earning real money, I made sure nobody knew about it. The truth was this: I was a forensic compliance consultant, and I was very, very good at what I did. Most people don't even know this job exists until they need it. Companies hire me when they suspect something is wrong, but can't quite put their finger on what. When the numbers don't add up, but look clean on the surface. When an employee's behavior raises red flags, but there's no obvious evidence of wrongdoing. When they need someone who can sift through thousands of documents, emails, and transactions to find the thread that unravels everything. I specialized in fraud detection and discrepancy analysis. I could look at a spreadsheet and spot the patterns that indicated someone was moving money where it shouldn't go. I could read email chains and identify the careful language people used when they were trying to cover their tracks. I understood how systems worked, and more importantly, how people manipulated those systems when they thought no one was watching. My clients included mid-size corporations, law firms preparing for litigation, and occasionally government contractors who needed an independent review of their compliance procedures. I worked remotely, which meant no office politics, no visibility, no colleagues who might mention my work to mutual acquaintances. Just me, my laptop, and complex puzzles that paid between $100 and $200 an hour depending on the project. I'd been doing this for 8 years. Michael's college fund was already substantial. We had 6 months of expenses and savings. I maxed out my retirement contributions every year. We weren't wealthy by any means, but we were comfortable in ways my family couldn't imagine. And they never would imagine it, because I'd learned that in my family, money I earned would either become something Carol felt entitled to redistribute to Vanessa, or something Vanessa would resent me for having. Better to let them think I was barely scraping by working some vague computer job that didn't pay very well. Better to be underestimated than to become a target. The skills I developed in this work weren't just about spreadsheets and transaction logs. They were about understanding human behavior, recognizing patterns, knowing how to document everything in ways that would hold up under scrutiny, building cases that were so thoroughly evidenced that they became irrefutable. I'd spent years helping corporate lawyers take down executives who thought they were too smart to get caught. I'd traced money through shell companies and identified the signatures of embezzlement in expense reports that looked perfectly legitimate on first glance. I'd sat in depositions and watched people who'd been so confident in their schemes crumble when confronted with the meticulous documentation of their own actions. And now my sister, with her professional credentials and her carefully planned false report, had made one critical miscalculation. She'd assumed I was still that quiet, defeated girl who accepted whatever treatment the family decided to give her. But that girl had grown up. She'd gotten educated. She'd built expertise in exactly the kind of systematic investigation that reveals truth hidden under layers of manipulation. The irony wasn't lost on me. What my family also didn't understand was how differently I'd chosen to raise Michael. Everything I did as a mother was a conscious rejection of how I'd been raised. When Michael came home from preschool, excited about a drawing he'd made, I didn't just glance at it and move on. I asked him about it. I let him explain every crayon mark, every color choice, every detail that mattered to him. I hung his artwork on the walls, not hidden on the refrigerator, but in frames in the living room where visitors could see them. When he struggled with math in 2nd grade, I didn't tell him he should just figure it out or that he wasn't trying hard enough. I sat with him every evening working through problems together, celebrating small victories, normalizing the idea that struggling with something didn't mean you were failing. When he came to me upset about something that happened at school, a friend who'd been mean a game where he'd been left out, I didn't tell him to toughen up or stop being sensitive. I listened. I validated his feelings. I helped him process emotions instead of suppressing them. I taught Michael that his needs mattered, that his feelings were valid, that asking for help was strength, not weakness, that speaking up when something was wrong wasn't disrespectful, it was necessary. And this, I now realized, was what Carol and Vanessa found most threatening. Michael wasn't silent the way I'd been forced to be silent. He had opinions. He asked questions. He defended people he loved. He had boundaries. These qualities, confidence, emotional awareness, the ability to stand up for himself and others, were exactly what healthy child development looked like. But to my mother and sister raised in and perpetuating a family system that required certain people to be small and quiet and accommodating, Michael's healthy assertiveness looked like rebellion. His emotional intelligence looked like manipulation. His protective instinct toward me looked like aggression. They'd punished him for being everything I'd taught him to be. They'd weaponized the child protection system against a child who was actually being protected and raised well precisely because he wasn't being raised to accept the kind of treatment I'd endured. Sitting in my living room the morning after they took Michael after hours at the police station had finally ended with him being released into my custody with a warning that CPS would be following up. I looked around at the modest house that hid the truth of who I really was. The worn couch that was actually paid off. The older television that I could replace tomorrow if I wanted. The simple curtains that disguised windows in a house I could afford to buy, but chose to rent for the flexibility. The whole carefully constructed image of struggle that protected us from my family's tendency to take whatever they thought they were owed. Michael was asleep in his room, exhausted from trauma no 10-year-old should experience. And I was awake, my laptop open, already beginning to do what I did best: investigate, document, and build a case. They thought I was still the quiet, average daughter who never quite measured up, but they had no idea they'd just picked a fight with the woman companies hired to uncover other people's lies. In the 3 days after Michael came home from that police station, I did what I always did when facing a problem. I needed to understand. I investigated. Michael stayed home from school that first week. I called it a personal day, then extended it when I saw how he flinched at sudden noises and couldn't sleep without the light on. But while he recovered, drawing pictures with his therapist and slowly beginning to talk about what had happened, I began pulling threads. I started with public information, the kind of digital breadcrumbs that people forget they leave behind. Vanessa's professional social media was carefully curated photos from school events, inspirational quotes about child advocacy, links to articles about recognizing trauma in students. She projected exactly the image a school counselor should project: caring, competent, vigilant. But social media is a performance, and I'd learned long ago to look beneath the performance. I searched the school district's board meeting minutes, which were publicly accessible online. Most of it was tedious bureaucratic language about budgets and policy updates, but I knew how to scan for relevant keywords. I found it buried in a meeting from 8 months ago. A brief mention of reviewing protocols following an incident requiring hospitalization of a student previously assessed by counseling services. No names, no details. Just enough to tell me something had gone wrong. I cross-referenced the timeline with local hospital records, not the medical information which was protected, but the public notices that hospitals are required to file with the county. A child named Emma Patterson, age 6, treated for a fractured arm in the emergency department. The date was exactly 2 months after that vague mention of protocol review. I needed more, so I did something I'd done countless times in corporate investigations. I looked at the metadata. School districts maintain public complaint logs stripped of identifying information but categorized by department and type. I found 3 entries from a teacher in the elementary school where Vanessa worked, filed over a 6-month period, all marked as concern regarding counseling department response to reported student welfare issue. The teacher had tried to raise alarms multiple times, and someone, almost certainly Vanessa given her position, had dismissed those concerns. I could piece together what had likely happened. A teacher notices a child showing signs of abuse or severe neglect, bruises, dirty clothes, behavioral changes. She reports it to the school counselor as protocol requires. The counselor, Vanessa, makes an assessment. Maybe she interviews the child, maybe she contacts the parents. Maybe she decides the bruises look consistent with normal childhood activity, that the other signs aren't severe enough to warrant a formal CPS report. She closes the case. But the teacher keeps noticing things, keeps documenting, keeps feeling that something isn't right. She goes back to the counselor, who reassures her that it's been handled. The teacher, not satisfied, files complaints with the school administration. Then the child ends up in the hospital with a broken arm. The hospital records it as an accidental fall, so no mandatory abuse investigation is triggered. But the timing is damning. The teacher's concerns are suddenly validated, and Vanessa's professional judgment is called into question. I could imagine the conversations that followed. The principal asking Vanessa to explain her assessment. The supervisor making informal comments about being more thorough in the future, about erring on the side of caution when it comes to child safety. No formal discipline, because nothing could be definitively proven. But the whispers would have started. The doubt. The knowledge that her colleagues were questioning whether she'd missed something obvious, whether her judgment could be trusted. For someone like Vanessa, whose entire identity was wrapped up in being the competent professional, the golden child who did everything right, that doubt would have been unbearable. She needed to prove she was vigilant, thorough. The kind of counselor who didn't miss warning signs, who acted decisively to protect children even when it was difficult. She needed a success story to balance the scales. And there was Michael, conveniently available and connected to the sister she'd spent a lifetime resenting. I found more evidence of the planning in places Vanessa probably thought were safe from scrutiny. Her social media posts from 6 weeks before the dinner had shifted subtly. More content about recognizing behavioral red flags in children. An article she shared about the importance of mandated reporters acting on gut instinct. A comment on a professional forum about the courage it takes to report family members when necessary. She was building a narrative, publicly establishing herself as someone who took these responsibilities seriously. Then I made a call to a friend who worked in county records and asked about CPS advisory line logs. These calls weren't formal reports, they were consultations where professionals could ask hypothetical questions about whether a situation warranted formal action. The calls were logged but not attributed to specific cases or children. My friend couldn't give me details, but she could tell me that someone from Vanessa's school phone number had called the CPS advisory line 3 times in the month before Michael was arrested. 3 times asking carefully worded hypothetical questions about what would constitute reportable concerns in a child living with a single mother who worked long hours. Each call had been recorded, each one documented, each one a building block in the case Vanessa was constructing. I thought back to the dinner, replaying it with this new understanding. The way Vanessa had arrived late, already looking distressed. The calculated comments throughout the meal, each one planting a seed. Difficult child concerning behaviors, access to medication, aggressive tendencies. She'd been setting the stage, making sure there were witnesses to Michael's supposed problems before the police arrived. The whole thing had been choreographed. The tears, the claims, the timing, all of it designed to create a dramatic intervention that would demonstrate Vanessa's professional courage and judgment. My sister hadn't snapped in a moment of hysteria. She hadn't overreacted out of genuine fear. She'd planned this for weeks, maybe months, carefully documenting and building toward a moment where she could call 911 with a pre-written script of concerns that would force police and CPS to take her seriously. Michael had been a prop in her professional rehabilitation. My 10-year-old son, traumatized and handcuffed and treated like a criminal, was collateral damage in Vanessa's desperate attempt to prove she hadn't failed Emma Patterson. She'd sacrificed a child to cover for failing a different child. The realization hit me like ice water. This wasn't about family dynamics or old resentments, though those had certainly made it easier for her to choose Michael as her target. This was about a professional who'd made a serious error in judgment and was willing to destroy an innocent child's sense of safety to avoid facing the consequences of that error. And my mother had helped her do it. Carol, who'd always protected Vanessa at my expense, had stood there confirming lies and watching her grandson get handcuffed without a moment's hesitation. I sat back in my desk chair looking at the timeline I'd constructed, the documents I'd compiled, the pattern I'd uncovered. What I thought was a hysterical overreaction that night was actually the final act of a plan my sister had been rehearsing for weeks. Understanding Vanessa's calculated planning didn't prepare me for waking up the next morning to discover that our private nightmare had become public entertainment. My phone started buzzing before 7 a.m., text messages from numbers I barely recognized, some from people I hadn't spoken to in years. I ignored them at first, focusing on getting Michael breakfast and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But the messages kept coming, and finally I opened one from a woman who lived 3 streets over, someone I'd exchanged pleasantries with at the neighborhood pool last summer. "I'm so sorry you're going through this," the text read. "I saw the video. If you need to talk, I'm here." What video? I opened Facebook on my laptop while Michael was in the bathroom and my stomach dropped. The post had been shared 47 times already, and it was only 7:15 in the morning. The video came from a doorbell camera, one of those Ring devices that neighbors install to monitor package deliveries and suspicious activity. Whoever owned it had a clear view of my mother's driveway and front walkway. The footage was grainy, but unmistakable. Police car lights strobing blue and red across the frame. 2 officers walking a small figure Michael down the front path, his hands clearly cuffed behind his back, even though the video quality made details fuzzy. And there I was, stumbling out behind them, my face twisted in anguish, reaching toward my son. The caption read, "Police called to incident on Maple Grove tonight. Looks like things got out of control. Anyone know what happened?" The comments section was a wildfire of speculation and judgment. "I heard it was the kid," someone wrote. "Apparently, he threatened other children at a family gathering. The grandmother had to call the police." "Single mom," another commenter observed, as if that explained everything. "No father in the picture. What do you expect? This is what happens when there's no discipline in the home," someone else added. "Kids today are out of control and parents just make excuses." A few people pushed back. "We don't know the whole story," one reasonable voice wrote. "Maybe we shouldn't jump to conclusions." But those comments were buried under an avalanche of assumptions. People who'd never met me, who knew nothing about our lives, were constructing an entire narrative from 15 seconds of doorbell footage. I was the negligent single mother. Michael was the troubled child. The police intervention was proof of our dysfunction. Someone had shared the video to a larger community group that covered 3 zip codes. Then someone else had shared it to a parenting forum. By 8 a.m., I stopped counting the shares. My private hell had gone viral in my own neighborhood. The real consequences became clear when I took Michael back to school on Monday. I'd kept him home for 3 days, but his therapist had gently suggested that returning to routine might help him feel safer, more normal. I'd agreed, hoping that his friends and the familiar structure of school would provide comfort. I was wrong. We were barely through the front doors when I saw another mother physically turn her daughter away from us, steering the girl in the opposite direction with a hand on her shoulder. The mother didn't look at me, but the message was clear. Michael noticed. His hand tightened around mine. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered, though I wasn't sure it was. His classroom teacher, Mrs. Patterson, greeted us at the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She'd always been warm with Michael before, the kind of teacher who ruffled kids' hair and gave enthusiastic high fives. Now she kept a professional distance, her hands clasped in front of her. "Good morning, Michael," she said. "Why don't you go put your backpack in your cubby?" As soon as he was out of earshot, her expression shifted to something more guarded. "Mrs. Walsh, Principal Hendricks, would like to see you before you leave. She's expecting you in her office." The principal's office smelled like coffee and printer toner. Dr. Sarah Hendricks sat behind her desk, her posture rigid with the kind of discomfort that comes from having to navigate a situation with potential legal implications. "Thank you for coming in," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I wanted to touch base about Michael's recent difficulties." "His recent arrest on false charges, you mean?" I said, keeping my voice level. Dr. Hendricks shifted in her chair. "I understand this is a sensitive situation, but I'm sure you can appreciate that the school has a responsibility to all of our students. When there are concerns about a child's behavioral stability, there are no concerns about his behavioral stability," I interrupted. "He was falsely accused by a family member. The police released him. There are no charges. Nevertheless," she continued, her tone suggesting she'd rehearsed this conversation, "given the circumstances, we think it would be appropriate for Michael to undergo a psychological evaluation, just to ensure he has the support he needs." The subtext was clear. They wanted documentation that my son wasn't dangerous. They wanted professional reassurance that he wouldn't hurt other children. They'd already decided he was a threat based on nothing more than the fact that police had been called. "I'll consider it," I said, though what I was really thinking was that I'd be documenting this conversation for the lawsuit I was increasingly certain I'd be filing. The worst part came at lunch. I'd started working from a coffee shop near the school those first few days, unable to focus at home but needing to be close in case Michael needed me. On Wednesday, I walked over to the school during lunch period, telling myself I just wanted to see that he was okay. I stood outside the fence that surrounded the playground, watching through the chain link as students scattered across the yard. It didn't take long to spot Michael. He was sitting alone under the large oak tree at the far corner of the playground, eating a sandwich from his lunchbox. Alone. Not playing with the group of boys who usually included him in their tag games. Not sitting with the kids from his class who normally clustered at the picnic tables. Just alone, systematically eating his lunch like it was a task to complete rather than a break to enjoy. As I watched, two boys ran past him, and one of them made a high-pitched wail, that I realized with a sick feeling was meant to imitate a police siren. The other boy laughed. Michael's shoulders hunched inward, making himself smaller. A girl from his class walked by with two friends. I saw her point at Michael and say something to her companions. All three looked at him, and then they deliberately turned and walked in a different direction, their body language broadcasting that he was someone to avoid. My phone buzzed with a text message. I looked down to see it was from Jen Morrison, a mother I'd chatted with at school pick up a dozen times over the past 2 years. Our sons had played together at the park. We'd coordinated playdates. The message read, "Hi, Rebecca. I hope you and Michael are doing okay. I wanted to let you know that until things are a bit clearer with everything that's going on, Tyler won't be able to come over to play. I'm sure you understand. Wishing you both the best." The polite, careful language couldn't hide what she was really saying. I think your son might be dangerous, and I'm protecting my child from him. I looked back through the fence at Michael still sitting alone under that tree, and something crystallized in my chest. This wasn't just about proving our innocence to CPS or clearing the police report. This was about the court of public opinion that had tried and convicted a 10-year-old based on a doorbell camera video and neighborhood gossip. Every parent who pulled their child away. Every teacher who suddenly treated Michael like a problem to manage rather than a student to nurture. Every kid who mimicked sirens or whispered behind their hands. Every single one of them was participating in the destruction of my son's childhood, his sense of safety, his ability to trust that the world was fair. And Vanessa had known this would happen. She'd counted on it. The social stigma was part of the punishment part of what would pressure me into silence and submission. As I watched my son eat lunch alone under the playground tree, I knew this wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. It was about making sure the people who did this answered for every whisper. I gave it 1 more week before I went to see my mother. 1 week of watching Michael withdraw further into himself, of fielding calls from the CPS caseworker, asking invasive questions, of feeling the weight of neighborhood judgment every time I left the house. 1 week of hoping that somehow Carol would reach out with even the smallest acknowledgement that this had gone too far. She didn't. So, on a gray Thursday afternoon, after I'd dropped Michael at his therapy appointment, I drove to my mother's house. I told myself I was going for closure, for one final attempt at reaching whatever part of her might still be capable of maternal feeling. But deep down, I think I knew what I'd find. Carol answered the door wearing gardening gloves, a trowel in one hand. She looked surprised to see me, but not uncomfortable. That should have been my first warning. "Rebecca," she said, not moving to let me in. "This isn't a good time." "I need to talk to you," I said. "Please, just 5 minutes." She sighed, the kind of put-upon exhale that suggested I was being difficult simply by existing, and stepped back to let me enter. The house smelled the same as it always had: vanilla candles and furniture polish. Everything in its place. Everything controlled. We didn't sit down. Carol stood in the foyer with her arms crossed, the trowel still in her hand like a weapon. "Mom," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. "What happened with Michael? It's gotten out of control. He's being treated like a criminal at school. Other kids won't play with him. He had nightmares every night this week. I just need you to understand." "Understand what?" Carol interrupted. "That you're playing the victim again. That you want everyone to feel sorry for you." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I pressed on. "This isn't about me. This is about a 10-year-old child who was handcuffed and humiliated based on lies. Vanessa overreacted, and I think if you just talk to her..." Vanessa was being a responsible professional. Carol said, her voice sharp and cold. She did what any trained counselor would do when they see warning signs. The fact that you can't accept that is exactly the problem. Warning signs? I felt my control slipping. Michael knocked over a glass and defended me when Vanessa was mocking me. "That's not a warning sign, that's normal child behavior." "Normal for a child with no discipline and no father figure," Carol cut in. "If you'd made better choices, Rebecca, if you'd married properly and given that boy a stable home instead of parading your independence around like it's something to be proud of, none of this would have happened." there it was. The blame I'd been absorbing my entire life, now redirected at my son. Every choice I'd made that didn't fit Carol's vision of what my life should be was being weaponized against Michael. "He has a stable home," I said, my voice shaking now. "I work hard. I'm present. I love him." "Love isn't enough when you don't know how to be a parent," Carol said. "Vanessa saw that. I saw it. The police saw it. Even CPS is concerned. Maybe instead of coming here to complain, you should be asking yourself why everyone else sees the problem except you." I felt something cracking inside me, some fundamental belief I'd been clinging to despite decades of evidence to the contrary. "You really believe that?" I whispered. "You actually think Michael deserved to be arrested?" Carol's expression didn't soften. "I think he needed a wake-up call before his behavior got worse. And I think you need to stop making excuses and take some responsibility." "Vanessa lied," I said, forcing the words out. "She manufactured evidence. She planned the whole thing. Don't you care about that? Don't you care that she used your grandson to cover for her own professional mistakes?" For just a moment, something flickered across my mother's face. Not quite guilt, but recognition. She knew. Of course she knew. She'd been part of the planning, standing there confirming Vanessa's lies to the police. "Sometimes," Carol said slowly, her eyes meeting mine with a hardness I'd seen 1,000 times before, "you have to do what it takes to protect the family." The word hung in the air between us. Family. Not our family. Not all of us. Just the family. Spoken with an emphasis that made it clear exactly who was included in that definition and who wasn't. The family meant Carol and Vanessa, the unit that mattered, the people worth protecting. Michael and I were not family. We were problems, threats to be neutralized, inconveniences to be managed. I'd spent 35 years hoping that someday my mother would see me, really see me, and recognize my worth. I'd endured years of being overlooked and undervalued, telling myself it was just her way, that she didn't mean it, that underneath the favoritism and criticism there was love. But standing in that foyer, watching her grip that garden trowel and defend Vanessa's calculated cruelty with the same casual dismissal she'd used my entire life, I finally understood. There was no love underneath. There never had been. I wasn't the wrong daughter because of anything I'd done or failed to do. I was the wrong daughter because Carol had decided I was probably before I was old enough to have any say in it, and nothing I achieved, nothing I sacrificed, nothing I endured, would ever change that fundamental designation. The realization should have destroyed me. Instead, it clarified everything. "I see," I said quietly. Carol must have heard something different in my tone because her expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "Good, then maybe we can move past this and—" "No," I interrupted. "We can't move past this. We won't, because you're right about one thing. I do need to protect my family. My actual family. Michael and me." I turned to leave and Carol called after me, "Rebecca, don't be dramatic, this isn't—" But I was already walking out, closing the door behind me with a quiet click that felt more final than any slam. I drove home in a strange calm, the kind of clarity that comes after you stop fighting against a truth you've known for years but refuse to accept. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I wasn't sad anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was done. Michael was still at therapy, which meant I had an hour alone. I made myself a cup of tea chamomile, which I never drank but kept in the cabinet for some reason, and carried it to my desk. Before sitting down, I went to Michael's room. He'd left his stuffed bear on the bed, the same threadbare brown bear he'd slept with since he was 2. I picked it up, remembering the night I'd bought it for him, how he'd clutched it in the hospital nursery with the same fierce grip he used now when the nightmares came. My son deserved better than this. Better than a family that would handcuff him to prove a point. Better than a grandmother who thought he needed to be cut down to size. Better than a mother who kept hoping for love from people who were incapable of giving it. I set the bear back on his pillow and returned to my desk. Opening my laptop felt like coming home to myself. This was my territory. The world of evidence and documentation of building cases that couldn't be argued with because they were built on facts rather than feelings. I created a new folder on my desktop, labeled it simply Case File. Then I began to work, not with emotion, not with hope that I could make them understand or change them into better people, just with the cold, methodical precision I'd been trained to use when dismantling fraud. I would document everything, build a timeline, gather evidence, identify the holes in their narrative and the patterns in their behavior. I would approach this exactly the way I'd approach a corporate investigation, because that's what this was now, a case to be solved, not a family to be saved. Begging hadn't worked. It had never worked. But facts properly documented and strategically deployed, those were different. My mother had taught me to be invisible. My sister had taught me to be silent. But I'd taught myself to be thorough, intelligent, and absolutely relentless when I had a case to prove. That night, for the first time in my life, I stopped trying to be their good daughter and decided to become their worst mistake. The morning after my visit to Carol's house, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. The hurt was still there, but it had transformed into something more useful purpose. I started with the police report. This was public record, something any citizen could request, but I knew most people didn't bother because they assumed it would be complicated or expensive. It wasn't. I called the records department of the police station, identified myself calmly and professionally, and requested a copy of the incident report from the date Michael was taken. "There's a $5 processing fee," the clerk told me. "It'll be ready in 3 business days." "Perfect," I said. "I'll pick it up in person." And when I collected the report that Friday afternoon, I took it to a coffee shop rather than reading it at home. I needed to approach this with professional distance, not maternal emotion. I ordered a black coffee, sat at a corner table, and opened the manila envelope. The report was 3 pages long. The responding officers had documented the call, the scene, the interviews with Vanessa and Carol, and their observations of Michael. Standard procedure, neutral language, nothing surprising, until I got to the section containing Vanessa's statement. That's where I saw it. Her account of events wasn't written in the panicked, disjointed language of someone genuinely frightened. It was carefully constructed, each sentence designed to hit specific trigger points. I felt unsafe in the presence of the child. Not, "he scared me." Pattern of concerning behavior over several weeks. Not, "he's been acting strange lately." As a mandated reporter with professional training in child welfare, I felt obligated to act, establishing her credentials right in the statement. Every phrase was calculated to invoke protocol to make the officers feel they had no choice but to take her seriously. She'd avoided making specific factual claims that could be easily disproven, instead using feelings I felt, professional judgments concerning behavior, and institutional authority, mandated reporter. I'd seen this kind of language before in corporate investigations. When someone was lying outright, they often made concrete claims that could be checked and debunked. But sophisticated liars knew to couch everything in subjective assessments and professional opinions, creating a shield of plausible interpretation around their deception. Vanessa had written this statement knowing exactly how to weaponize the system while protecting herself from accusations of filing a false report. She could always claim she genuinely felt concerned that her professional training led her to err on the side of caution. But she'd made one critical error, she'd put it all in writing, creating an official record that could be examined, cross-referenced, and compared to other evidence. I took out my phone and called Dana Mitchell. Dana and I had met during freshman orientation at college, bonded over being scholarship students in a sea of trust fund kids, and stayed in touch through the years, even as our lives took different paths. She'd gone to law school with the specific goal of doing civil rights work and now worked for a legal aid organization that specialized in cases where institutions failed vulnerable people. "Rebecca," she answered, sounding surprised. "It's been months. How are you?" "I need your professional help," I said. "Not as a friend, as a lawyer, and I can pay your standard rate." There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her tone had shifted to something more focused. "Tell me what's going on." I spent the next 20 minutes laying out the case exactly as I would present it to a client. No tears, no emotional appeals, just facts, timeline, and evidence. I explained Vanessa's position as a school counselor, her mandated reporter status, and what I'd discovered about the Emma Patterson case. I described the dinner, the arrest, the language in the police report. I outlined the social consequences Michael was facing, the CPS involvement, and Carol's role in confirming Vanessa's narrative. Dana listened without interrupting. I could hear her typing, occasionally taking notes. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "This isn't family drama. This is abuse of professional authority, potential filing of a false report, and emotional harm to a minor. I'm in. I can pay." I started, but she cut me off. "My organization handles cases like this pro bono when there's a pattern of institutional failure. But Rebecca, I need you to understand what you're getting into. This won't be fast, it won't be easy, and it's going to get worse before it gets better." "I know," I said. "I'm ready." "Then let's meet tomorrow. Bring everything you have." The next morning, I drove to Dana's office in the city, a cramped suite in a building that had seen better decades. Her desk was covered with case files, her walls lined with law books and framed quotes about justice. She cleared space for us to work and spread out a yellow legal pad. "Okay," she said, pen ready. "Let's build the strategy." We spent 3 hours mapping everything out. Dana explained that we needed to approach this from multiple angles simultaneously, not just defending against Vanessa's claims, but building an affirmative case that what she'd done was actionable. First item, file a Freedom of Information Act request for any body cam footage from the responding officers. Most departments equipped their officers with cameras now, and that footage would show what actually happened versus what Vanessa claimed happened. "The FOIA request will take time," Dana warned. "They have 30 to 60 days to respond, and they often delay, but we need that footage. It's neutral evidence, and juries trust it." "Juries," I said. "We're going to pursue this civilly," Dana said. "Defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, possibly abuse of process. But we need to build the foundation first." Second item, obtain the 911 call transcript. That recording would capture Vanessa's exact words when she called, potentially showing premeditation or inconsistencies with her later statement. Third request, Michael's CPS file through the proper legal channels. I had a right to see what had been documented about my own child, but it required specific procedures. Fourth, arrange an independent psychological evaluation for Michael with a child psychologist who specialized in trauma. Not because I thought Michael needed fixing, but because we needed professional documentation of the harm Vanessa's actions had caused. "Everything from this point forward gets documented," Dana said. "Every interaction with CPS, every communication with your family, every impact on Michael's life. We're building a case, and that means evidence for every claim we make." She looked at me across the table, her expression serious. "They have institutional advantage right now. Vanessa has professional credibility. Your mother has social standing. The system tends to believe mandated reporters over parents. But here's what they don't have. They've created an official record. Every lie Vanessa told is now documented. Every time she elaborates on her story, there's more to compare and contrast. People who think they're clever often get sloppy when they feel safe." I felt something settle in my chest, a sense of solid ground after weeks of freefall. This was familiar territory. This was what I did building cases from scattered evidence, finding the inconsistencies following the paper trail until it revealed the truth. "How long?" I asked. "Months," Dana said. "Maybe a year or more if we go to trial. Discovery takes time. Depositions take time. The wheels of justice turn slowly." "I can be patient," I said. "As long as we're moving forward." Dana smiled, the kind of smile that said she'd worked with traumatized clients long enough to recognize when someone was ready to fight. "Then let's get started." As we finalized the initial action items, and I prepared to leave, Dana said something that stayed with me. Your sister may have institutional backing, but she just created an official record of her lies, and that's the thread we'll pull until everything unravels. The bureaucratic machinery of government moves at its own glacial pace, indifferent to the urgency of the people caught in its gears. Dana filed the Freedom of Information Act request the week after our first meeting, requesting all body cam footage from the officers who responded to my mother's house that night. The request was straightforward, properly formatted, accompanied by the required identification and fee. 2 weeks later, we received the first denial. The police department cited an ongoing CPS investigation as grounds for withholding the footage. Never mind that the CPS caseworker had already closed the immediate safety concerns and moved to routine monitoring. The existence of any open file was apparently sufficient to deny public access. Dana filed an appeal citing the specific statutes that required disclosure and arguing that my status as the parent of the child involved gave me standing to access the footage regardless of ongoing investigations. She was professional but firm, the kind of legal writing that made clear she knew the law better than whoever was denying the requests. Another month passed. Then we received a second denial, this time claiming the footage needed to be reviewed for privacy concerns and redacted appropriately. More delays. Dana filed a second appeal, this time with a subtle threat that continued obstruction might require judicial intervention. She didn't say lawsuit, but the implication was clear enough. Finally, in the third month after the initial request, a plain manila envelope arrived at Dana's office containing a thumb drive with the body cam footage. She called me immediately. "It's here. Can you come to the office this afternoon?" I arranged for Michael to stay with Mrs. Chen after school and drove to the city with my stomach in knots. I'd thought about this footage constantly during the 3-month wait, what it might show, what it might prove, whether it would help or hurt our case. Now I was about to find out. Dana's office felt smaller than usual as we settled in front of her computer. She'd pulled the curtains closed, shutting out the afternoon light, and positioned 2 chairs in front of her monitor. "Are you ready?" she asked, her hand hovering over the mouse. My hands were shaking slightly, so I clasped them together in my lap. "Yes." The video opened with a timestamp in the corner and a view of a police cruiser's dashboard. The camera was mounted on the officer's chest, so the perspective shifted as he moved. I could hear the radio chatter in the background, then his partner's voice confirming the address. The camera captured the walk up my mother's driveway, the perfectly maintained landscaping visible in the early evening light. The front door opened before they could knock, and there was my mother, her expression grave and concerned in a way I'd never seen directed at me. "Officers, thank you for coming," she said. "My daughter is here. My younger daughter called you, she's inside." The camera followed Carol into the house, and then the frame filled with Vanessa. She was crying, but watching it now with professional distance. I could see what I'd been too shocked to notice that night. Her tears were real enough, but her eyes weren't red or swollen. They were alert, tracking the officers' movements, assessing their reactions. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to call, but I had no choice. I'm a school counselor, a mandated reporter. I'm trained to recognize these patterns." The officer's voice came from behind the camera. "Can you tell us what happened, ma'am?" Vanessa took a shaky breath, but her response was anything but disorganized. "My nephew has been displaying an escalating behavioral pattern for several weeks. Tonight he showed concerning ideation regarding violence, and he attempted to access potentially harmful substances from my sister's purse. As a mandated reporter with training in child welfare, I felt I had a legal and ethical obligation to act." I watched Dana make a note on her legal pad. The language was too precise, too clinical for someone in genuine crisis. One of the officers asked, "Where is the child now?" "In the dining room with the other children," Vanessa said. "I've been trying to keep them separated, but he's been aggressive with them." The camera panned across the living room, and I could see other family members in the background. My aunt and uncle sat frozen on the couch. My cousin stood near the doorway looking uncomfortable. And there was Carol, her arms crossed, nodding along with everything Vanessa said. "That boy is just like his mother," Carol said, her voice carrying clearly to the camera. "Always destroying things. Always causing problems." The officers moved toward the dining room and the camera captured Michael at the kids' table, sitting very still, his eyes wide. He looked so small, so scared, even before he understood what was about to happen. What happened next I'd seen firsthand, but watching it from the officer's perspective added a horrible objectivity to it. The questions, the handcuffs, Michael's sobs, my own desperate attempts to explain while Vanessa continued her performance of concerned family member. But then, as the officers were leading Michael out, and I was being held back by one of them, the camera caught something I hadn't seen. Vanessa had stopped crying. She was watching this scene with an expression of satisfaction, and as the door closed behind Michael and the officers, she turned to Carol and said, voice low, but picked up by the audio, "Maybe now she'll stop acting like she's better than us." Carol's response was a soft laugh, the kind of sound you make when something vindicates a long-held belief. Dana paused the video. "That's admissible," she said quietly. "That's consciousness of guilt and improper motive caught on camera." But we weren't done. Dana scrolled back through the timestamp to the beginning of the footage before the officers entered the house. "Watch this part," she said. The earlier footage showed the officers arriving, but through the front window you could see into the dining room. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough to see what had happened during dinner. Michael was sitting at the kids' table, eating quietly. Vanessa was at the adult table, her back to the camera, but her voice audible. "Some people just can't maintain relationships," she was saying. "Some women are just the kind that men leave. It's sad, really, for the children who have to suffer because of their mother's choices." The other adults shifted uncomfortably, but no one contradicted her. The camera caught Michael's reaction. He looked toward the adult table, then down at his plate, his small hands clenching into fists. Vanessa continued in the same light conversational tone that made the cruelty seem almost casual. "I mean, when a man walks away from his own child, you have to wonder what he saw in the mother that made him want to run." That's when Michael stood up. The camera angle wasn't ideal, but you could see him clearly enough. "Stop being mean to my mom," he said, his voice loud, but not threatening the voice of a child who'd reached his limit. He gestured with his hand, that universal childhood emphasis of feeling, and his elbow caught the glass of water sitting on the edge of the table. It tipped water, spreading across the surface. Michael immediately looked stricken, the anger gone, replaced by worry that he'd done something wrong. But Vanessa had what she needed. Dana stopped the video again. "He was provoked," she said. "Systematically, deliberately provoked. And his response was completely age-appropriate, defending his mother, not threatening anyone." I stared at the frozen image on screen. She twisted everything. "She didn't just twist it," Dana said. "She created the conditions that would give her something to twist. This is premeditation, Rebecca. This is proof." When I heard my sister brag on camera that this would teach me a lesson, I knew I'd just found the thread that could unravel her entire life if I pulled it carefully enough. The body cam footage was devastating evidence, but Dana warned me that showing our hand too early could give Vanessa and Carol time to prepare their defenses, to craft explanations, to rally their own support systems. The key to building an airtight case was patience. "Let them think they've won," Dana advised. "Let them get comfortable. Comfortable people make mistakes." So I changed my strategy entirely. I stopped calling my mother, stopped sending angry texts to Vanessa, stopped trying to explain or defend myself to extended family members who'd already chosen sides. I went silent in a way that my family would interpret as submission rather than strategy. The shift was subtle but deliberate. When Vanessa sent me a text 3 days after we received the body cam footage, I responded in a way designed to make her feel secure in her victory. Her message read, "I hope you've learned something from this experience, Rebecca. Michael needs structure and boundaries, not coddling. This could be a fresh start for both of you." My fingers wanted to type what I really thought, that she was a calculating liar who'd traumatized a child to cover her own professional failures. But instead I wrote, "Just trying to focus on Michael. Thank you for your concern." Neutral, non-confrontational, the kind of response that suggested defeat and acceptance. Within hours, I heard from my aunt that Carol had told people at church, "Rebecca finally understands she needs to accept guidance. This has been hard on her, but sometimes tough love is what's needed." Perfect. They thought I'd surrendered. Over the next few weeks, I watched as their guard dropped. The family group chat, which I'd muted but still monitored, became increasingly revealing. Vanessa sent a message about how some children just need firmer boundaries than others, accompanied by a laughing emoji when my cousin responded, "Well, he certainly got them." Carol posted on Facebook publicly about how sometimes the hardest thing a family can do is intervene when they see destructive patterns, but it's an act of love. Church friends commented with supportive messages about her strength and wisdom. She shared several of these comments, basking in the validation. I screenshot everything. Every text message went into a digital folder organized by date and sender. Every Facebook post was captured with full context: the post itself, the comments, the shares. Every email from church members congratulating Carol on taking a stand or praising Vanessa for her professional courage was preserved with complete headers showing timestamps and routing information. I created a master timeline document, the same kind I used for complex fraud investigations. Each piece of evidence was cataloged with date, source, and contextual notes about what it revealed. When Vanessa joked in the group chat about Michael finally learning respect, I noted how that phrasing revealed the punitive rather than protective motivation behind her actions. When Carol shared an article about entitled parents who refuse to discipline their children, I documented it as further evidence of her bias against me predating the incident. This wasn't just collecting evidence. This was constructing an irrefutable narrative, a story told through their own words that would be impossible to explain away as misunderstanding or misinterpretation. Dana had taught me that in civil cases, patterns matter more than isolated incidents. One cruel text could be dismissed as a momentary lapse, but dozens of messages over weeks showing consistent malice and self-congratulation about harming a child created a pattern that spoke to character and intent. Every smug message they sent thinking I was too defeated to fight back became another entry in my documentation. Meanwhile, I focused on Michael's healing, though I knew that every step of that healing also served to document the harm they'd caused. I found Dr. Sarah Chen, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma. Her credentials were impeccable, and more importantly, she understood that sometimes therapy needed to serve dual purposes, helping a child heal while also creating a professional record of that child's experience. Michael saw Dr. Chen twice a week. In those early sessions, he was reluctant to talk about what had happened. He'd draw pictures instead: police cars with oversized lights, houses with bars on the windows, stick figures with enormous sad faces. Gradually, with Dr. Chen's gentle prompting, he began to articulate his experience. The nightmares where police came to school and took him away in front of everyone. The way he felt his heart race whenever he saw a police car on the street. The shame of being treated like he was dangerous when he'd only been trying to defend me. "I thought I was bad," he told Dr. Chen in a session I listened to through the one-way mirror. "I thought I did something really wrong, but I don't know what." Dr. Chen helped him understand that defending someone you love isn't wrong, that his feelings of anger at Vanessa's cruelty were normal and valid, that being handcuffed and arrested was a traumatic experience that would take time to process. I didn't tell Michael about the larger case we were building. He was 10 years old. He didn't need the burden of knowing his mother was preparing to sue his aunt and grandmother. I just told him that Dr. Chen was helping grown-ups understand what really happened so that other kids wouldn't have to go through what he did. After each session, Dr. Chen wrote detailed notes for her clinical file. She documented Michael's symptoms using the proper diagnostic terminology: trauma response, anxiety, hypervigilance, shame, internalization. She noted the specific triggers, police sirens being separated from me situations where he felt he couldn't defend himself or others. She tracked his progress but also the persistence of certain symptoms that suggested long-term psychological impact. These weren't just therapy notes. They were evidence prepared with the knowledge that they might eventually be presented in court that would demonstrate the concrete harm Vanessa's actions had caused to a child's mental health and sense of safety. Each week I received a copy of Dr. Chen's session summaries. Each one went into the master file cross-referenced with the timeline, building a comprehensive picture of cause and effect. Vanessa's false report caused trauma. The trauma manifested in specific documented ways. The healing required professional intervention and would take months, if not years. In the family group chat, Vanessa sent a message asking, "How's Michael doing? I hope he's adjusting well." I responded, "He's working through it. We're taking it one day at a time." She replied with a heart emoji and, "I'm glad you're getting him help." I screenshot the exchange and filed it under awareness of harm. She knew she'd hurt him. She just thought she'd gotten away with it. They mistook my quiet for defeat, never realizing every smug message they sent was another log I was stacking on a fire they wouldn't see until it was far too late. By the 5th month after Michael's arrest, Dana and I had assembled what she called a compelling preliminary case. The body cam footage, the documented timeline, Michael's therapy records, and the archive of my family's self-incriminating messages formed a foundation. Now it was time to take the first official action. We filed a formal complaint with the State Board of Professional Counselors and Therapists, the licensing body that governed Vanessa's credentials as a school counselor. Dana drafted the complaint over several days, and I reviewed it with the same critical eye I'd use for a corporate investigation report. The document was 15 pages long, meticulously organized and deliberately devoid of emotional language. We weren't asking the board to sympathize with a hurt sister or traumatized nephew. We were presenting evidence of ethical violations by a licensed professional. The complaint detailed the family relationship between Vanessa and me, establishing the personal conflict that should have disqualified her from making professional judgments about Michael. It included time-stamped screenshots from the body cam footage, particularly the moment where Vanessa said this would teach me a lesson, demonstrating that her motivation was punitive rather than protective. We documented the 3-week timeline of Vanessa's concerns about Michael, showing how she'd systematically built a case rather than responding to an immediate threat. We cited the specific ethical standards in the professional code of conduct that prohibited using mandated reporter status to pursue personal vendettas or failing to disclose conflicts of interest when making reports. The final section requested a formal investigation into whether Vanessa had violated her professional obligations and whether her license should be subject to disciplinary action. Dana filed it electronically and via certified mail, ensuring we had proof of receipt. "Now what?" I asked as we watched the confirmation email arrive. "Now we wait," Dana said. "The board has to acknowledge receipt within 2 weeks, then assign an investigator. They'll interview Vanessa, review the evidence, possibly interview witnesses. The whole process typically takes 9 to 12 months before there's any hearing or decision." "A year," I said, the timeline feeling impossibly long. "Filing is just the beginning," Dana explained. "But it starts the clock, and more importantly, it creates a public record. Vanessa can't make this go away quietly." The licensing board sent an acknowledgement letter 3 weeks later, confirming they'd received the complaint and assigned it a case number. A copy of that letter would have been sent to Vanessa, informing her that she was under investigation. I didn't have to imagine her reaction. I saw it the following month when a process server knocked on my door and handed me legal papers. Vanessa had hired an attorney and filed for a temporary restraining order against me, claiming I was engaging in harassment and obsessive retaliatory behavior that made her fear for her safety. The petition included a piece of evidence I'd forgotten about in the chaos of everything else, a video taken in the school parking lot 2 months earlier, shortly after Michael had returned to school and started experiencing the social isolation. I'd seen Vanessa there during afternoon pickup, Something inside me had snapped the weeks of watching my son suffer the sleepless nights, the constant anxiety. I'd walked over to her car and confronted her, my voice raised, demanding to know how she could live with what she'd done to a child. Someone had recorded it on their phone. In the video, I looked unhinged, emotional, aggressive. Vanessa looked frightened and defensive. Without context, it appeared to show exactly what her petition claimed: an unstable woman harassing her sister. The judge granted a temporary restraining order requiring me to stay at least 100 yards away from Vanessa for 10 days, with a hearing scheduled to determine whether it should be extended. Those 10 days were humiliating. I couldn't pick up Michael from school because Vanessa sometimes did pick up for her own children. I had to arrange for Mrs. Chen to handle it, which meant explaining why. The neighborhood gossip network, already primed to think the worst of me, had new fuel. At the hearing, Dana came prepared. She brought the body cam footage, the timeline showing Vanessa's calculated planning, and testimony from Dr. Chen about the harm Vanessa's false report had caused. She argued that my confrontation, while perhaps ill-advised, was the understandable reaction of a mother whose child had been traumatized. The judge denied the permanent restraining order, finding insufficient evidence that I posed a credible threat to Vanessa's safety. But the damage was done. For 2 weeks, court records showed that I'd been subject to a restraining order that a judge had found enough merit in claims about my behavior to issue temporary protection. Vanessa's lawyer tried to spin it as a victory, but Dana knew better. "She showed her hand," Dana said after the hearing. "She's scared, and scared people fight back. But fighting back creates more evidence." While preparing for the restraining order hearing, I dug deeper into Vanessa's professional history, searching for anything that might explain her desperation to create a success story with Michael. That's when I found the reference buried in school board meeting minutes from 8 months before the dinner at Carol's house. The minutes were public record posted on the district website in PDF format, usually ignored by everyone except the handful of people who attended the meetings. Item 7 under Old Business. Administration provided update on review of counseling department protocols following incident requiring student hospitalization. Revisions to mandated reporter training and documentation requirements to be implemented next semester. No names, no details, just enough to indicate something had gone wrong. I cross-referenced the date with local hospital admission records, which logged pediatric cases by age and general category. A 6-year-old female treated for arm fracture emergency department visit. Then I found the teacher complaints. These were also public record maintained by the district in compliance with state education law, though identifying information was redacted. 3 formal complaints filed by an elementary school teacher over a 6-month period, all categorized under concern regarding counseling department response to reported student welfare issue. A teacher had seen something, had reported it to the school counselor, had been dissatisfied with how the counselor handled it, had tried multiple times to get someone to take her concerns seriously. Then a child ended up in the hospital. I could piece together what had likely happened, and it explained everything about why Vanessa had been so desperate to prove her professional vigilance with Michael. The day Vanessa got the letter from the licensing board requesting her presence at a formal investigation interview, she thought it was bad luck. She still had no idea I was the storm behind it. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while I was working through a fraud analysis for a manufacturing client. The subject line read, "Meeting request. Michael Walsh Academic Placement." I opened it with a sense of dread that had become familiar over the past 5 months. "Dear Ms. Walsh," it began in the overly formal tone that school administrators used when delivering bad news. "We would like to schedule a meeting to discuss Michael's current educational placement and explore whether an alternative learning environment might better serve his needs at this time. Several teachers have expressed concerns about his social integration and emotional regulation in the traditional classroom setting." Alternative learning environment. That was code for moving him out of regular classes, possibly into a program for children with behavioral problems or special needs. They wanted to segregate my son based on a false accusation to mark him permanently as different, as damaged. I read the email 3 times, each time feeling my control slip a little further. Michael had been having a hard time, yes. He was quieter in class, more withdrawn. His teacher had mentioned he seemed distracted and emotionally distant. But that wasn't behavioral dysfunction, it was trauma response. It was a 10-year-old child trying to process being handcuffed and publicly humiliated while adults around him treated him like a threat. And now they wanted to punish him further by removing him from the few friends he had left, by labeling him as a problem child who couldn't function in a normal classroom. I closed my laptop and grabbed my car keys. The drive to Michael's school took 12 minutes. I didn't have a plan, didn't think about what I was going to say or do. I just knew I needed to do something to push back against this tide of injustice that kept rising no matter how carefully I documented and strategized. I arrived during after-school pickup when the parking lot was crowded with parents collecting their children. I parked haphazardly and got out scanning the lot with mounting fury. And there she was. Vanessa standing next to her pristine SUV, chatting with another mother, as if she hadn't destroyed lives, as if this was just another pleasant afternoon. Something inside me broke. I walked straight toward her, my vision tunneling until all I could see was her comfortable smile, her casual demeanor, her complete absence of consequence. You. I said, my voice louder than I intended. You destroyed a child's life for your career. The parking lot went quiet. Parents turned to look. Children stopped mid-stride. Vanessa's expression shifted to shock, her hand going to her chest in a gesture of alarm. Rebecca, please, you're scaring me. Don't you dare play victim, I said, advancing another step. You know what you did. You know Michael didn't threaten anyone. You used him to cover your own mistakes, and now they want to put him in a special program because of the trauma you caused. Other parents were backing away, pulling their children closer. I could see phones coming out, could see the way they were looking at me, not with understanding, but with alarm. And Vanessa, I realized too late, had her own phone out recording. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice trembling perfectly. Please just leave me alone, I'm frightened. You should be frightened, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. A security guard was approaching. Parents were whispering, and Vanessa had it all on video, me looking unhinged, aggressive, unstable. Exactly the image of the out-of-control single mother she'd painted that night 5 months ago. The security guard asked me to leave. I complied, my hands shaking as I got back in my car, the adrenaline draining away to leave only sick realization of what I'd done. The video appeared as evidence in the restraining order hearing 3 days later. Vanessa's lawyer played it for the judge, arguing that I was fixated and unstable, that my harassment was escalating, that Vanessa feared for her safety. Dana countered with the body cam footage, with the context of what Vanessa had done to Michael, with the licensing complaint that explained why Vanessa might want to paint me as an aggressor. The judge denied the permanent restraining order, but the temporary one had already done its damage. For 2 weeks, I couldn't go within 100 yards of Vanessa. That meant I couldn't do school pickup on days she was there, couldn't attend school events, couldn't shop at the grocery store closest to my house because there was a chance we'd cross paths. I had to ask friends to pick up Michael to explain to them why without going into all the painful details. Mrs. Chen was kind about it, but I could see the questions in her eyes, the slight hesitation before she agreed. The worst part was explaining it to Michael. Why can't you get me Mom? He asked the first afternoon, sitting in Mrs. Chen's car and looking at me through the passenger window. There are some grown-up rules I have to follow for a little while, I said, keeping my voice steady. It doesn't mean anything is wrong. Mrs. Chen is helping us out. But he knew something was wrong. I could see it in the way he looked at me, in the confusion that added another layer to the anxiety he was already carrying. In Dana's office afterward, I finally broke down. I just wanted her to admit what she did, I said, my voice cracking. I wanted her to feel even a fraction of the pain she's caused, and instead, I gave her exactly what she needed to make me look unstable. Dana pushed a box of tissues across her desk. She let me cry for a few minutes before speaking. I know you're hurting, she said, and I know it feels impossible to stay calm when you're watching your son suffer because of someone's lies. But Rebecca, this is exactly what she wanted. You gave her a video that lets her play victim, that makes your completely justified anger look like dangerous instability. I know, I said miserably. Do you? Dana leaned forward. Because here's what I need you to understand, they're scared now. Vanessa knows the licensing board is investigating. Carol knows we have the body cam footage. They're desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. But angry people make mistakes too. We win this by staying smarter, colder, and cleaner than they are. She pulled out the timeline we'd been building, the carefully documented case that showed pattern and premeditation. This, she said, tapping the papers, is how we beat them. Not by confronting them in parking lots, not by giving them ammunition to use against you. We beat them by being so thorough, so strategic, so absolutely airtight in our case, that their lies become impossible to maintain. I wiped my eyes and looked at the evidence we'd assembled. Dozens of documents, hundreds of screenshots, a paper trail that told an undeniable story. You're right, I said. I know I am, Dana said, not unkindly. This is a chess game, Rebecca, not a street fight. Emotion is a liability. Evidence is power. I nodded, feeling something settle in my chest. I'd let my anger control me, and it had nearly derailed everything we'd built. I'd let my anger make me look exactly like the unstable mother they'd described, but I'd never make that mistake again. From now on, every move would be calculated. After the parking lot confrontation and the restraining order hearing, I returned to what I did best: methodical investigation. Dana had been right. Emotion was a liability. Evidence was power. The CPS file arrived 7 weeks after we'd requested it through proper legal channels. Under state law, I had the right to access records concerning my own child's case, but the bureaucratic process moved at its own pace. The file came in a thick manila envelope, 63 pages of case notes, interview summaries, and assessment forms. I spread the documents across my dining room table and began reading with the same analytical approach I used for corporate fraud cases. The first section contained the initial report, Vanessa's 911 call transcript, and her formal statement to CPS. Then came notes from the first interview with me at the police station, documented by Patricia Morton, the CPS worker I'd met that terrible night. But as I moved through the chronological progression of the file, something began to bother me. Certain phrases in later entries didn't match my memory of how interactions had actually occurred. An entry, dated 3 weeks after the initial incident, noted, "Mother became noticeably defensive when questioned about work schedule and childcare arrangements. Responses suggested difficulty accepting professional guidance." I remembered that interview differently. I'd been tired, certainly, and stressed about the ongoing investigation, but defensive, I'd answered every question directly. I had documentation. I'd started recording all my interactions with CPS on my phone after the first week of practice Dana had recommended. I pulled up the audio file from that interview and listened. My voice was calm, if strained. When the caseworker asked about my work hours, I'd said, "I work from home most days with flexible hours. When I do have meetings or deadlines that require focused time, my neighbor Mrs. Chen watches Michael, or he's in the after-school program." That wasn't defensive. That was a straightforward answer to a direct question. Another entry, dated a month after the incident, stated, "Concerns remain about home stability, given mother's inconsistent work schedule and limited family support system. Mother showed inappropriate emotional responses when discussing family relationships." Inappropriate emotional responses. I'd gotten teary-eyed when asked about why I didn't have more help from my mother and sister. That seemed like an entirely appropriate emotional response to a painful family situation. I called Dana. "Something's wrong with the CPS notes. They don't match what actually happened." "Bring the file to my office," she said. "Let's look at it together." We spent 2 hours going through the documentation, comparing the dates of entries to my own timeline. Dana pointed to something I'd missed initially, the metadata in the digital file headers. "Look at the created versus modified dates," she said, pulling up the properties panel. This entry says it documents an interview from week 2, but the file wasn't created until week 4. And it was modified again in week 6. So someone went back and added to their notes later. Or changed them, Dana said. It's not uncommon for caseworkers to update files as they gather more information, but the timing is suspicious. Week 6 was right when Vanessa was preparing the restraining order petition. These additions make you look unstable, unreliable, they support her narrative. I pulled out another document from my own investigation files, phone records I'd obtained through a data request from my cell phone provider. They showed incoming and outgoing calls during the investigation period. Then I did something I'd done countless times in corporate investigations. I cross-referenced patterns. CPS caseworkers typically have minimal contact with mandated reporters after the initial report unless there are follow-up questions. Maybe 1 or 2 calls during an active investigation. But when I looked at call logs from the CPS office to Vanessa's cell phone, I found 11 calls over a 6-week period, each lasting between 4 and 12 minutes. That wasn't normal follow-up. That was ongoing consultation. I needed to know who was making those calls. Using the licensing complaint discovery process, Dana had obtained a list of personnel at CPS who had access to our case file. There were 3 caseworkers assigned to our geographic area: Patricia Morton, who I'd met initially, Marcus Williams, and Jennifer Hastings. I searched public records for professional connections between these 3 caseworkers and Vanessa. Nothing for Morton or Williams. But Jennifer Hastings had attended 3 professional development conferences in the past 2 years. The same 3 conferences where Vanessa had presented workshops on identifying trauma in children. They knew each other. Possibly well. I went deeper using tools I'd developed for tracking corporate communications. Conference attendance logs published presenter lists, professional association membership directories. I found a photo from a conference networking event 2 years ago. Jennifer Hastings and Vanessa in a group shot with other child welfare professionals, both smiling, colleagues, maybe friends. Then I found what I needed buried in the discovery documents from Vanessa's licensing investigation. Her personal email account had been subpoenaed as part of that investigation, and Dana's paralegal had spent days sorting through thousands of messages. One email jumped out, sent from a Gmail account that belonged to Jennifer Hastings to Vanessa's personal email dated 4 weeks into the CPS investigation. The subject line was simply FYI. The body read, "Hey, I checked the protocol manual like you asked. If you emphasize the medication access concern in any supplemental statements, it triggers mandatory extended monitoring at least 90 days. Also, from the interview yesterday, your sister mentioned working long hours when deadlines hit. That's something we can explore more in the next home visit. Might be worth documenting pattern of insufficient supervision. Hope this helps. Coffee soon." I read it 3 times, my heart pounding. This wasn't a caseworker doing her job. This was someone actively coaching Vanessa on how to weaponize CPS protocols more effectively. She was sharing information from my confidential interviews and advising Vanessa on what concerns to emphasize to maintain system pressure. It wasn't outright falsification of records that would be too obvious, too risky, but it was manipulation from within the system using insider knowledge to help someone with a personal vendetta maintain institutional leverage. I called Dana immediately. "I found it," I said. "I found proof that Vanessa has someone inside CPS helping her." Dana came to my house that evening. We went through the phone records, the conference connections, and most importantly, the email. She photographed everything, made copies, and began drafting a formal complaint to the CPS director and the state ombudsman who oversaw Child Protective Services. "This changes everything," Dana said. "This isn't just about Vanessa anymore. This is about corruption within a system that's supposed to protect children. When institutions get weaponized like this, it puts every family at risk." "What happens to Jennifer Hastings?" I asked. "At minimum, she'll be removed from our case immediately. She'll likely face disciplinary proceedings, suspension, possibly termination, depending on how serious the department treats this. And she becomes a witness in our civil case against Vanessa because this email proves coordination and malicious intent." I looked at the email again at that casual sign-off. Hope this helps. Coffee soon. This woman had helped destroy my son's sense of safety, helped maintain institutional pressure that kept Michael and me under surveillance for months, all while pretending it was professional due diligence. Knowing my sister had an ally inside the system didn't scare me. It just meant there would be two people sitting on the trapdoor when I finally pulled the lever. While I was uncovering institutional corruption and building legal cases, Michael was doing his own quiet work of trying to understand what had happened to him and why. Dr. Chen's office was on the second floor of a medical building decorated with soft colors and comfortable furniture that didn't feel clinical. Michael had been seeing her twice a week for 3 months now, and for most of that time he'd been resistant to talking directly about the night of his arrest. Instead, he drew. Pictures of police cars with lights that took up half the page, houses with windows that had bars across them, stick figures with enormous hands, sometimes in handcuffs. Dr. Chen never pushed him to explain the drawings. She'd just sit with him occasionally, asking gentle questions, letting him process at his own pace. I watched most sessions through the one-way mirror in the adjacent observation room, a tissue box always within reach. Then, in the 8th month after that terrible dinner, something shifted. Dr. Chen asked a different kind of question. Not, "How did you feel?" or, "Can you tell me about that night?" but simply, "What were you trying to do that night at dinner?" Michael looked up from the drawing he'd been working on, another police car this one, with a small figure visible in the back seat. "I was trying to make her stop," he said quietly. "Make who stop what?" Dr. Chen asked, her voice gentle. "Aunt Vanessa. She was saying mean things about my mom. Like really mean things." "What kind of things?" Michael's small hands clenched into fists on his lap. "She said that men always leave my mom, that she can't keep people around because there's something wrong with her, that my dad left because of who my mom is." Through the mirror, I pressed my hand against my mouth, fighting the urge to burst through the door and hold him. "How did that make you feel?" Dr. Chen asked. "Mad," Michael said, his voice stronger now. "It made me so mad because it's not true. My mom is nice, my mom is good. And Aunt Vanessa was saying it like it was funny, like everyone should laugh about it, and everyone was just sitting there not saying anything. So what did you do?" I stood up and I said, "Stop being mean to her." And I was pointing at Aunt Vanessa like this. He demonstrated his arm, gesturing an emphasis. And my elbow hit the glass and it fell over. And then everyone got quiet and looked at me like I did something really bad. "Did you mean to knock over the glass?" "No." Michael's voice cracked. "It was an accident. I was just trying to make her stop being mean to my mom. I didn't threaten anybody. I didn't try to hurt anyone. I just wanted her to stop." Dr. Chen made notes on her pad. "Michael, it sounds like you were trying to defend your mother. Is that right?" "Yeah," he said. And then his voice got very small. "But I made everything bad." That's when I couldn't stay in the observation room anymore. I knocked softly, and Dr. Chen nodded permission for me to enter. Michael looked up at me with eyes full of guilt and grief. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry I made everything bad. If I'd just been quiet like you always are, the police wouldn't have come. You wouldn't have had all these problems. It's my fault." I knelt in front of his chair and took his hands in mine, my own vision blurring with tears I'd been holding back for months. "Michael, listen to me very carefully," I said. "You didn't make this happen. You stood up for someone you love. You saw something wrong and you used your voice to say stop. That is not wrong. That is never wrong. But the police? What they did with your words, what Aunt Vanessa did with your completely normal reaction to her cruelty, that's on them, not on you. You were being a good son, a brave kid. You did nothing wrong." Dr. Chen joined us, her voice professional but warm. "Michael, do you know the difference between protecting someone and hurting someone?" He nodded uncertainly. "You were trying to protect your mom from words that hurt. That's love and loyalty. You didn't threaten violence. You didn't try to physically harm anyone. You had feelings, strong feelings about seeing someone you love being hurt, and you expressed those feelings. That's healthy. That's normal. That's what children should feel safe doing. But the police put handcuffs on me, Michael whispered. Yes, they did, Dr. Chen said. And that was wrong. That was adults making bad decisions based on lies someone told. That was the system failing you. But it wasn't because of anything you did wrong. Over the next 2 sessions, Dr. Chen worked with Michael on processing his guilt and understanding the difference between protective anger and violence, between having strong feelings and being dangerous. Then she suggested something that became a turning point. Michael, sometimes it helps to write down what happened in your own words. Not for anyone else, just for you to help organize your thoughts and feelings. Would you like to try that? He agreed, and the following week he brought a letter written in his careful 10-year-old handwriting on lined paper from his school notebook. Dr. Chen read it aloud during our family session with Michael's permission. Dear Dr. Chen, this is what really happened. Aunt Vanessa was being mean to my mom at dinner. She said things that made my mom look sad. She said my dad left because my mom can't keep people around. I got mad because that's not true and it was mean. I stood up and said, "Stop being mean to her." I was pointing and I knocked over the glass by accident. I didn't mean to. I didn't try to hurt anybody. Then the police came and put handcuffs on me. It hurt my wrists and I was really scared. I didn't understand why loving my mom made me bad. I still don't understand. From Michael. The room was silent, except for my quiet crying. Dr. Chen looked at me over the top of the letter. I'm going to include this in my formal assessment report. With your permission, this becomes part of the record, not just my clinical observations, but Michael's own account of what happened and how it affected him. Yes, I managed to say. Please. That night, after Michael was asleep, I sat with a copy of his letter and realized something that changed the entire scope of what I was doing. This wasn't just about clearing our names or punishing Vanessa and Carol for what they'd done to us. It was about making sure that the next child who loved their parent enough to defend them, who had normal feelings about cruelty, wouldn't be handcuffed and traumatized by a system that was supposed to protect children. When my son asked if his truth could protect other children from what happened to him, I realized my fight had quietly grown bigger than just our family's broken table. Michael's letter became part of Dr. Chen's formal assessment report, which was filed with CPS and would eventually become evidence in the civil case Dana was building. But while we were focused on documenting truth, Carol was escalating her own campaign. The legal notice arrived by certified mail in early month 9, 8 months after that terrible dinner. Another envelope, another attack, this time from a family law attorney whose letterhead advertised expertise in grandparent rights and custody disputes. Carol had filed a petition with the family court seeking court-ordered visitation with Michael, claiming I was engaging in parental alienation and causing psychological harm to my son by preventing him from maintaining relationships with his extended family. The petition was a masterpiece of distortion. It cited the restraining order incident as evidence of my unstable and vindictive behavior. It referenced the CPS investigation as proof that professionals had concerns about my parenting. It noted that Michael had not attended any family gatherings in 8 months, framing this as my malicious isolation of a child from his loving grandmother, rather than my protection of him from people who'd traumatized him. The petition included affidavits from church members who attested to Carol's character, describing her as a devoted grandmother and pillar of the community. It painted me as an obsessive single mother pursuing baseless legal actions against family members out of spite. The lawyer Carol had hired was expensive, the kind who advertised in glossy magazines and had a corner office downtown. I wondered briefly how she was affording this on her retirement income, but pushed the thought aside. There were more immediate concerns. Dana read through the petition with a clinical eye. "This is harassment," she said. "She's trying to force you to drop everything by creating multiple legal fronts. Defending against this will cost time and money, and she knows it." "Can she actually get court-ordered visitation?" Grandparent rights laws vary by state. In most places, grandparents can petition for visitation, but courts generally rule in favor of parental authority unless there's clear evidence that denying contact harms the child. Given everything we have documented Michael's trauma, Carol's role in causing it, she's unlikely to win. But she can make you fight. 2 days after the petition arrived, my phone rang with my mother's number. I almost didn't answer, but something told me to hear what she had to say to document it, so I hit record on my phone's voice memo app and picked up. "Rebecca," Carol said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "I'm giving you one last chance to be reasonable." "Reasonable about what?" "Drop the licensing complaint against Vanessa. Stop this ridiculous vendetta. Let this family heal." "Let this family heal," I repeated, my voice flat. "The family that handcuffed my 10-year-old son, that family." "If you don't drop all this nonsense," Carol said, her tone shifting to something darker, "I will tell everyone the truth. Everyone. I'll tell Michael. I'll tell the church. I'll tell the court." "What truth?" "That you're not your father's biological child. That you're the result of an affair I had 37 years ago. That you're illegitimate Rebecca. A bastard. Is that what you want your son to know about his mother? That she's the product of adultery and lies?" The words hung in the air between us. Carol had deployed what she clearly thought was her nuclear option, the secret that would force my compliance through shame and fear. But as I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, I felt something unexpected. Nothing. No shock, no shame, no fear of exposure. "Are you threatening me with something that happened before I was born?" I asked. "Something I had no control over." "I'm telling you that I can destroy what's left of your reputation," Carol said. "You think people judge you now? Wait until they know you're not even legitimate." "I don't care," I said, and realized as I said it that it was absolutely true. "I don't care who my biological father is. I don't care what people from your church think about something that happened in 1988. I care about protecting my son from people who hurt him. That's all." Carol was silent for a moment, clearly not having anticipated this response. "You'll regret this," she finally said. "I regret a lot of things," I replied. "But standing up for Michael will never be one of them." I hung up and saved the recording. But that night alone, after Michael was asleep, the weight of everything crashed down on me. The grandparent rights petition, the ongoing CPS monitoring, the whispers at school, the money we were spending on legal fees, the constant vigilance, the documentation, the fight that seemed to expand rather than resolve. I opened my laptop and started researching cost of living in other state school districts with good ratings, remote work opportunities. We could move, start over somewhere nobody knew us, where Michael could be just another kid without this history following him. I called Dana the next morning and voiced the thought that had kept me up most of the night. "Maybe we should just leave," I said. "Move somewhere else. Start fresh. Is fighting really worth putting Michael through all of this?" Dana was quiet for a moment. "I can't make that decision for you, but I need you to think about what that would teach him." "What do you mean?" "If you run, Michael learns that power wins, that people who lie and manipulate get what they want, that the truth doesn't matter as much as avoiding discomfort. Is that the lesson you want him to carry into adulthood?" I called Dr. Chen next and told her about my moment of doubt. "Running is a valid choice," she said carefully. "Sometimes removing yourself from a toxic situation is the healthiest option. But Rebecca, you're not running from toxicity. You're running from a fight you're winning. Michael is healing. The evidence you've built is comprehensive. Carol and Vanessa are getting desperate because they know you're succeeding. Leaving now would abandon all of that." She was right. They both were. When my mother threatened to weaponize a secret she thought would destroy me, she still didn't understand that I'd stopped caring what she thought years ago. I only cared what she'd done. Carol's failed attempt to shame me into submission had the opposite effect. Instead of retreating, I doubled down on my investigation. If Vanessa was desperate enough to frame my son, there had to be a reason beyond simple sibling rivalry. I returned to the school board meeting minutes I'd flagged months earlier, the vague reference to reviewing protocols after an incident. This time, I approached it systematically, the way I would approach a corporate fraud case where someone was trying to hide a pattern. I started with hospital records. County hospitals were required to report pediatric emergency admissions to a public database stripped of names but categorized by age, injury type, and general circumstances. I searched the time frame around that board meeting and found what I was looking for. 6-year-old female fractured arm emergency department visit mechanism of injury listed as fall from playground equipment. Then I cross-referenced this with school attendance records, which were also public information in aggregate form. The same time frame showed an uptick in absences for first-grade students at Vanessa's elementary school. I needed a name. That required going through formal complaint logs maintained by the school district. These were public records under state education law, though identifying information about students was redacted to protect privacy. What wasn't redacted were the complainant's roles and the general nature of concerns. I found 3 formal complaints filed by an elementary school teacher over 6 months, all categorized under concern regarding counseling department response to reported student welfare issue. The complaints were dated first one 8 months before Michael's arrest, second one 6 months before, third one 4 months before. 2 months after the third complaint, the hospital admission occurred. I filed a public records request for non-confidential information about students who'd been both the subject of counseling department interventions and subsequent emergency medical treatment. The district's legal office pushed back initially, citing privacy concerns, but Dana crafted a carefully worded argument about the public interest in oversight of mandatory reporting systems. 3 weeks later, I had a name: Emma Patterson. Through the licensing investigations discovery process, Dana had obtained copies of Vanessa's case notes from the school district. I found Emma's file buried among dozens of other cases Vanessa had handled over the years. The initial report came from Emma's kindergarten teacher documenting concerns about unexplained bruises on the child's arms and legs, withdrawn behavior in class, the same dirty clothes worn multiple days in a row, and frequent absences. Vanessa's notes showed she'd interviewed Emma's parents once at their home. Her assessment read, "Parents cooperative and concerned, home clean and adequately furnished, child's bruising consistent with active outdoor play. Mother explained irregular laundry schedule due to work demands. No evidence of abuse or neglect. Case closed." But the teacher hadn't stopped there. I found the emails Dana had subpoenaed from the school's server. The first email sent 2 weeks after Vanessa closed the case. "Hi, Vanessa. I'm still seeing concerning signs with Emma. She came to school in the same outfit for the 3rd day in a row, and when I asked if she'd had breakfast, she said she couldn't remember the last time she ate at home. Can we revisit this?" Vanessa's response: "Thank you for your continued vigilance. I'll monitor the situation. Please keep me informed if you observe additional concerns." A second email 6 weeks later. "Vanessa Emma has missed 4 days this month. When she is here, she seems fearful and won't make eye contact. I really think we need to involve CPS." Vanessa's response: "I understand your concern. However, based on my professional assessment and home visit, I don't believe CPS involvement is warranted at this time. Please continue to document any specific incidents." A third email 2 months after that: "I'm formally requesting that this case be reopened or escalated. Emma is showing multiple red flags that are being ignored." No response from Vanessa to that one. Instead, the teacher had filed a complaint with the school principal. 1 month later, Emma Patterson was in the emergency room with a fractured arm. The hospital recorded it as an accidental fall. The parents explained she'd fallen from monkey bars at a park, and because there was no prior CPS involvement on record, no abuse investigation was triggered. But the teacher's complaint remained in the school board files, and the timing a child hospitalized shortly after a counselor dismissed repeated concerns had prompted that protocol review mentioned in the board meeting minutes. Vanessa had faced an informal conversation with her supervisor. No formal discipline. No note in her personnel file. Just a quiet warning to be more thorough in future assessments. But the whispers would have started. Questions about her judgment. Concerns about whether she'd missed something obvious. I showed everything to Dana in her office, spreading the timeline across her desk. She didn't frame Michael because she's evil, I said. She did it because she was desperate. She needed to create a case where she identified danger early and acted decisively, a success story to offset Emma. My son was collateral damage in her career rehabilitation. Dana studied the documents, her expression grave. This changes everything. This isn't just about family grudges anymore. The licensing board needs to see this pattern: first missing real danger when a child actually needed intervention, then creating fake danger when a child was safe. That's not a one-time error in judgment. That's a professional who can't be trusted to make life-or-death decisions about children's safety. Can we use this? We have to use this because we're not just protecting Michael now, we're protecting the next Emma Patterson, the next child who might be in real danger while Vanessa's too busy creating false cases to cover her mistakes. The child Vanessa failed to protect was the key to protecting mine, and to making sure she'd never endanger another. The Emma Patterson discovery changed my approach. This was no longer just about my family's dysfunction. It was about public safety, about protecting children from someone whose judgment had already failed once, and who'd responded by manufacturing a false crisis. Dana advised that before moving forward with including the Emma case in the licensing complaint, I should give Vanessa one chance to come clean voluntarily. If she cooperates, admits everything, and agrees to leave the profession, it gives us leverage for the civil case without a prolonged licensing battle. If she refuses, we have evidence that she was given the opportunity to do the right thing and chose not to. Through our respective attorneys, we arranged a face-to-face meeting. The message to Vanessa's lawyer was simple. Client is willing to discuss possible settlement of all matters. In-person meeting requested. We met in a conference room at a neutral law office, sterile and professional, with a long table and uncomfortable chairs. Vanessa arrived with her attorney, a sharp-looking woman who'd clearly prepared her client to give nothing away. I came with Dana and a folder containing everything we'd uncovered. Vanessa looked older than when I'd last seen her up close months ago in that parking lot confrontation. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, a tightness to her mouth that suggested sleepless nights. We sat across from each other, and I felt a strange detachment, as if I were observing a corporate fraud meeting rather than facing my own sister. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," I said, my voice professionally neutral. "I wanted to give you the opportunity to understand the full scope of what we've uncovered before this proceeds any further." I opened the folder and began laying out documents. First, the body cam footage stills showing her statement to police, and more damning, her comment to Carol about teaching me a lesson. Then the email exchanges between her and Jennifer Hastings, the CPS insider. Then the timeline of her documentation of Michael's behaviors over the 3 weeks leading up to the dinner. Vanessa's attorney took notes, but said nothing. Then I placed Emma Patterson's file on the table. "This is what I think happened," I said, looking directly at my sister. 8 months before you called the police on my son, you closed a case you shouldn't have closed. A teacher tried to tell you something was wrong. You dismissed her concerns. 2 months later, that child was in the hospital. Your supervisor questioned your judgment. You panicked, and you decided the best way to prove you were still competent was to create a case where you identified danger and acted decisively, even if you had to manufacture the danger yourself. Vanessa's face had gone pale. Her attorney touched her arm, a warning gesture, but Vanessa shook her head. "The Emma case was complicated," she said, her voice strained. "The parents were defensive. The home visit showed adequate care. I made a professional judgment based on the evidence available. And when a teacher kept raising concerns, you ignored her. I was monitoring the situation." "No," I interrupted. "You were hoping it would go away so you wouldn't have to admit you'd missed something." Vanessa's composure cracked. "I was under so much pressure. You don't understand what it's like having every decision questioned, knowing one mistake could end your career. When my supervisor started asking questions about Emma, I thought if I could just show I was vigilant with the next case, thorough, willing to act even when it was difficult. Her voice trailed off. "So, you chose Michael," I said quietly. "You chose my son to be your proof that you hadn't failed." "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Vanessa said, and now there were tears. "I thought the police would just talk to you, maybe recommend some parenting classes. I didn't think they'd handcuff him. I didn't think—" "You didn't think about him at all," I said. "You thought about yourself." Vanessa wiped her eyes and leaned forward. "Please, Rebecca. I'll drop everything. I'll tell CPS it was all a misunderstanding. I'll write a public apology if you want. Just don't report the Emma case to the licensing board. Let me handle it privately. I'll leave the profession if that's what you want, but please don't make it official." I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw someone I'd once shared a childhood with, someone I'd cared for when she was small, someone who'd grown into a person willing to traumatize a child to save her own reputation. "You had the chance to do the right thing 8 months ago," I said. "When you realized Michael's arrest had gone further than you intended, you could have told the truth. When CPS got involved, you could have admitted you'd overreacted. When your friend Jennifer started coaching you on how to make it worse, you could have stopped. You had dozens of chances. You chose to hurt my son instead. I can't let you stay in a position to hurt other children." Vanessa's tears stopped as suddenly as if I'd flipped a switch. Her face hardened into an expression I'd never seen before, cold, calculating rage. "Then I'll burn everything down, including you," she said, her voice low and venomous. "You think you're so much better than me, you've always thought that. The perfect older sister, so quietly superior. Fine. I'll make this so ugly, so public, so painful that you'll wish you'd taken the deal. You have no idea what I'm capable of." I stood up, gathering my folder. I survived our mother's favoritism for 35 years. I survived single parenthood. I survived you trying to take my child. You have no idea how much ugliness I can endure, and you're about to find out that you can't. As my sister promised to destroy me, I felt something unexpected. Not fear, but pity for someone who still didn't understand the difference between winning and being right. 2 months after my confrontation with Vanessa in that conference room, 13 months after the night police handcuffed my son, the licensing board hearing finally convened. The setting was deliberately impersonal, a government building conference room with fluorescent lights, beige walls, and a long table where 3 board members sat with neat folders arranged in front of them. The panel consisted of Dr. Margaret Hartley, a retired school counselor with 30 years of experience, Dr. James Coe, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma, and Patricia Simmons, the state licensing administrator whose job was to enforce professional standards. I sat in the back row of chairs reserved for observers, Dana beside me. Michael was at school, unaware that today might mark the beginning of justice for what had been done to him. Vanessa entered with her attorney, and I had to admire the performance she'd prepared. She wore a navy suit that projected professional competence. Her hair pulled back in a neat bun, minimal makeup that suggested seriousness rather than vanity. She carried a leather portfolio and walked with the confident posture of someone who'd presented to boards and panels before, someone who belonged in rooms like this. Her attorney was accompanied by character witnesses. Carol, dressed in her church best, ready to testify to her daughter's dedication to children. 2 colleagues from the school district who would speak to Vanessa's professionalism. A parent whose child Vanessa had helped through a difficult time. Vanessa's prepared statement emphasized her years of service, the impossible pressures facing mandated reporters who must make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between a child's safety and catastrophic oversight. She spoke about the weight of responsibility, the fear of missing warning signs, the professional obligation to err on the side of caution. It was a good performance. I watched one board member nod sympathetically. Then Dana stood to present our case. She didn't rush. She didn't use emotional appeals. She simply laid out evidence in chronological order, each piece building on the last, until the pattern became undeniable. First, the body cam footage. The board watched Vanessa's tearful report to police, her clinical language designed to trigger protocols. Then they watched the moment after the officers thought the camera was off when Vanessa leaned to Carol and said, "Maybe now she'll stop acting like she's better than us." Dr. Coe leaned forward, replaying that section twice. Next, Dana presented the 3-week timeline of Vanessa's documentation before the dinner, showing how she'd systematically built a case rather than responding to an immediate threat. She highlighted Vanessa's calls to the CPS advisory line, the careful construction of concerns that would require official action. Then came the emails between Vanessa and Jennifer Hastings, the CPS worker who'd coached her on which protocols to trigger, which phrases to emphasize, how to maintain institutional pressure. Dr. Hartley took extensive notes, her expression growing more troubled with each exhibit. Dana presented Michael's therapy records, Dr. Chen's formal assessment, and finally Michael's letter in his own 10-year-old handwriting. She read it aloud, her voice steady. "I got mad because Aunt Vanessa was being mean to my mom. I said stop. I didn't mean to knock over the glass. I didn't try to hurt anybody. The police scared me. I don't understand why loving my mom made me bad." The room was very quiet. Then Dana introduced the Emma Patterson file. She walked the board through Vanessa's assessment that closed the case, the teacher's repeated concerns that were dismissed, the hospital admission 2 months later, the formal complaint about inadequate response. She showed the pattern with devastating clarity. A counselor who'd missed real danger faced questions about her judgment and responded by creating a false case to prove her vigilance. "This isn't about one difficult judgment call," Dana said. "This is about someone who used her professional authority to settle a personal grudge, weaponizing child protection systems that are supposed to be sacred trusts. And when that system failed to protect a real child in danger, instead of accepting accountability, she manufactured danger where none existed to prove she wasn't the counselor who'd made mistakes. She used her own nephew as career rehabilitation." Vanessa's attorney stood attempting to salvage the defense. She spoke about workplace pressure, liability fears, statistics about mandated reporters facing lawsuits. She painted a picture of impossible situations where counselors must make judgment calls with incomplete information. She was gaining ground until Dr. Hartley spoke. "Ms. Walsh," she said, addressing Vanessa directly, "can you explain the comment captured on body cam about teaching your sister a lesson?" Vanessa opened her mouth, closed it, then said, "I was upset. I spoke without thinking." "For 3 weeks?" Patricia Simmons asked. "Because the evidence shows you documented concerns about your nephew for 3 weeks before calling police. That's not a spontaneous reaction." Vanessa's lawyer tried to interject, but Dr. Coe had another question. "What about Emma Patterson? When her teacher expressed ongoing concerns, why did you stop responding to her emails?" Vanessa's face lost color. "That was a separate case with different circumstances." "Was it separate?" Dr. Coe asked. "Or was your nephew's case a reaction to questions about your handling of Emma's situation?" Vanessa looked at her lawyer, who had no good answer to give. The board deliberated for 40 minutes. When they returned, Chairwoman Simmons read the decision in a flat, official tone. "Based on the evidence presented, this board finds clear violations of professional ethics codes, including conflict of interest in reporting abuse of mandated reporter status, and a pattern of judgment failures that raise serious questions about fitness to practice. Ms. Walsh's license is hereby suspended pending a full investigation into the Emma Patterson case. We will reconvene in 60 days to determine whether permanent revocation is warranted." As the chairwoman announced the suspension of my sister's license, I watched the first real crack appear in Vanessa's polished mask, and I knew gravity would do the rest. Vanessa's license suspension was a victory, but Dana reminded me we still had the civil lawsuit to pursue. The licensing action addressed Vanessa's professional misconduct, but it didn't provide accountability for the harm done to Michael or compensation for the trauma therapy costs and damage to our lives. The civil case moved forward on parallel tracks: one against Vanessa for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and abuse of process. another against Carol for her role in confirming and amplifying Vanessa's lies. 14 months after that terrible dinner, Carol's deposition was scheduled. A deposition is testimony given under oath before trial recorded by a court stenographer with all parties' lawyers present. Everything said becomes part of the permanent record and can be used as evidence. Lying in a deposition is perjury, a criminal offense. We gathered in another sterile conference room, Dana Carol's attorney, a stenographer with her recording equipment, and Carol herself dressed as if she were going to church, her posture rigid with defensive indignation. The first hour covered routine background, Carol's employment history, her role as Michael's grandmother, the frequency of family gatherings. Dana's questioning was methodical, establishing baseline facts before moving to more dangerous territory. Then Dana shifted gears. Mrs. Walsh, have you or any member of your immediate family ever been the subject of a Child Protective Services investigation? Carol's response came too quickly. No, absolutely not. Dana slid a document across the table. Let me show you what's been marked as Exhibit 12. This is a CPS case summary with your name and former address. The case number is listed here. Does this refresh your recollection? Carol barely glanced at it. I don't know what that is. There must be some mistake. Mrs. Walsh, you're under oath. I'll ask again, were you ever the subject of a CPS investigation? Carol's lawyer, a man named Harrison, who specialized in defending difficult clients, requested a break. Can we have 5 minutes? When they returned, Carol's face was ashen and Harrison looked resigned to an unpleasant task. Walsh would like to clarify her earlier answer, Harrison said stiffly. Dana waited, pen poised. There was a situation many years ago, Carol said, her voice tight. But it was resolved. It has no bearing on current matters. Let me decide what's relevant, Dana said. Tell me about this situation. What emerged over the next 90 minutes was a story I'd been too young to fully understand when I lived it, told now in Carol's own words, under the weight of legal consequences for lying. When Vanessa was between 4 and 5 years old, Carol had suffered what she called a difficult period. She'd been prescribed medication for anxiety following Vanessa's birth, delayed postpartum depression, though she didn't use that term. The medication led to dependency. She was taking more than prescribed, sometimes mixing pills, functioning but not truly present. During this time, the household fell into disarray. Vanessa, still a preschooler, sometimes went to school in dirty clothes. Sometimes she hadn't been bathed properly. Sometimes she arrived hungry because breakfast hadn't been prepared. Who was caring for Vanessa during this time? Dana asked. Carol hesitated. Rebecca helped. Rebecca was 8 years old, correct? Yes. So an 8-year-old child was providing care for a 4-year-old while you were incapacitated. I wasn't incapacitated, Carol said sharply. I was managing a household and dealing with stress. Rebecca was just helping like older siblings do. Dana pulled out another document, the preschool teacher's report to CPS obtained through the old case file we'd finally gotten unsealed through court order. The teacher had documented concerns about Vanessa arriving in soiled clothing, appearing unkempt, seeming hungry and withdrawn. She'd tried to reach Carol multiple times before filing the report. When CPS investigated, what did you tell them? Dana asked. Carol's jaw tightened. I explained that I was under stress and that my older daughter wasn't helping the way she should, that the household difficulties were partly because Rebecca wasn't cooperative. You blamed an 8-year-old child for the neglect of her 4-year-old sister. I was trying to explain the family dynamics, Carol said defensively. What was the resolution? I completed a brief outpatient treatment program for the medication issue. I showed CPS the home was adequate. They closed the case. Dana leaned forward. And did you ever acknowledge to Rebecca that you'd blamed her for your own failures? Did you ever apologize for scapegoating a child who was actually trying to care for her neglected sister? That's not how it was, Carol said, but her voice lacked conviction. How was it then? I was sick. I didn't know what I was doing. It was a different time. People didn't understand mental health the way they do now. Dana made notes, then asked the question that made Carol's lawyer shift uncomfortably. Mrs. Walsh, Would you say you have a history of using child protective systems inappropriately? First manipulating a CPS investigation to blame Rebecca for your own neglect of Vanessa, and now confirming false allegations about Michael to protect Vanessa from accountability. Harrison objected, but the question hung in the air, already recorded in the transcript. The pattern was undeniable: decades of protecting Vanessa at my expense, using whatever system or institution was available to do it. Watching my mother admit under oath what she'd done to me, to both of us, I finally understood that her favoritism wasn't love. It was guilt she'd been paying off my entire life. Carol's deposition had exposed the buried past, but it also raised a practical question that I couldn't ignore. During the discovery process for our civil lawsuit, Dana had requested Carol's financial records to establish her ability to pay potential damages. When those records arrived, Dana called me with a question. Your mother's claiming financial hardship, but she's hired Harrison DeWitt for the grandparent rights case. Do you know what his retainer is? No idea. Minimum $25,000. Plus he bills at $400 an hour. For someone living on retirement income and Social Security, that's a significant expense. The discrepancy nagged at me. Carol lived modestly in a paid-off house, drove an older car, claimed she was on a fixed income. Yet she'd somehow funded an expensive legal campaign against me while also supporting Vanessa's lifestyle: the down payment on Vanessa's SUV 2 years ago, the private school tuition for Vanessa's daughters. I remembered something else. Carol had served as church treasurer for 7 years, only stepping down last year when the pastor implemented a policy requiring rotation of financial positions. She'd also been HOA treasurer for the neighborhood for at least 5 years. I'd spent nearly a decade tracking corporate fraud. I knew what financial irregularities looked like. I started with public records. Church financial reports were available to members, and as someone who'd grown up in that church, I technically still counted as a member even though I hadn't attended in years. I called the church office and requested copies of annual financial reports for the past 8 years. The HOA financial disclosures were even easier. They were posted on the Neighborhood Association website for all residents to review. I spread the documents across my dining room table and began the kind of analysis I'd done hundreds of times for corporate clients. The first thing that jumped out was the difference in operating expenses between Carol's tenure and the new treasurer's first year. Under Carol's management, the church's monthly operating expenses averaged $8,200. Under the new treasurer, they averaged $6,800, a difference of $1,400 per month. I looked at the line items. Emergency building repairs appeared frequently in Carol's reports. $800 here, $1,200 there, always with vague descriptions. Community outreach supplies was another recurring category, never itemized, never with receipts attached. The new treasurer's reports were different. Every expense over $200 had a receipt. Emergency repairs were documented with contractor invoices. Supply purchases listed specific items. I did the math. Over 7 years, the discrepancy added up to approximately $35,000 that had been categorized as legitimate church expenses but couldn't be accounted for with documentation. The HOA records showed a similar pattern. During Carol's tenure, discretionary community enhancement expenses averaged $300 per month more than under previous or subsequent treasurers. Over 5 years, roughly $18,000. None of this was definitive proof of embezzlement by itself. But I'd learned in my work that patterns of undocumented expenses, consistent overages compared to other managers, and vague categorizations were red flags worth investigating. I cross-referenced the timing of certain large undocumented church expenses with Carol's known financial outlays. A $2,400 emergency roof repair in the church records corresponded with the month Vanessa bought her SUV. Carol had given her $3,000 for the down payment, claiming it was from her savings. And $1,800 supplies purchase coincided with the first tuition payment for Vanessa's daughters at private school. The pattern was clear. Carol had been systematically siphoning small amounts from organizations that trusted her, using those funds to supplement her income and support Vanessa's lifestyle. I compiled everything into a report the same format I used for corporate clients and provided it to both the church board and the HOA board of directors. I included no accusations, just documented discrepancies between Carol's financial management and standard practices with a suggestion that they might want to conduct an internal audit. Both organizations took the suggestion seriously. The church hired an independent accountant who confirmed what I'd found: approximately $35,000 in unaccounted-for expenses during Carol's tenure, most without proper documentation or receipts. The HOA's audit showed similar results. Neither organization wanted the scandal of criminal prosecution. Instead, they demanded full restitution plus interest. The church pastor, a kind man who'd nevertheless seen the evidence, asked Carol to resign from all committee positions. The HOA board voted to remove her immediately and threatened civil action if repayment terms weren't met. Carol had 30 days to arrange payment. With no other assets, she listed her house for sale. The news spread through the community the way news always did: whispered conversations, carefully worded emails, the same gossip network that had condemned me now turning its attention to Carol. I heard from my aunt that Carol had stopped attending church services, unable to face the people she'd stolen from. The pastor had handled it discreetly, but word still got out. People who'd once praised her as a pillar of the community now avoided her in grocery store aisles. The irony wasn't lost on me. Carol had spent decades building a reputation as the responsible, moral, church-going woman who raised her daughters right, or at least raised one of them right. That reputation had been her shield, the thing that made people believe her over me, that gave weight to her confirmation of Vanessa's lies. Now that same community watched her fall from grace, forced to sell her home to repay money stolen from their tithes and HOA dues. Seeing my mother step down from her precious committees in disgrace, I realized I didn't need to shout my truth. Her own paper trail was doing that for me. With Vanessa's license suspended and Carol's embezzlement exposed, Dana laid out the next step: a comprehensive civil lawsuit against both of them. "We have 3 strong claims," she explained in her office. "Defamation: they made false statements that damaged your and Michael's reputations. Intentional infliction of emotional distress: their actions were so extreme and outrageous that they caused genuine psychological harm. And malicious abuse of process: they misused legal and protective systems for improper purposes." I hesitated. This will keep everything public for months, maybe longer. Michael's already been through so much. "He has," Dana agreed. "But what message does it send if we stop now, that people who lie and weaponize systems against children get away with it, as long as they're family? That truth doesn't matter as much as avoiding discomfort." I thought about Michael still flinching when he heard sirens, about the therapy sessions where he worked through shame that had been inflicted on him by people who should have protected him, about the lesson I wanted him to learn from all this. "File it," I said. The complaint was filed in month 15, and the discovery process began immediately. Both Vanessa and Carol were required to provide documents, answer interrogatories, and submit to depositions under oath. The depositions took place over 2 days in month 16 and 17, in the same kind of sterile conference rooms where Carol's earlier deposition had occurred. Vanessa went first, and she arrived composed, her attorney having obviously prepared her extensively. But composure under coaching is different from composure under cross-examination. Dana walked her through the timeline of events, asking her to recount details from the night of the dinner. Then Dana pulled out Vanessa's 911 call transcript and asked her to explain specific phrases. "You told the operator Michael attempted to access dangerous medications. What did you mean by that?" "He was looking in Rebecca's purse," Vanessa said. "Did you see him actually reach for medication?" "Well, no, but did you see medication in the purse?" "I knew Rebecca sometimes carried pain medication." Dana pulled out the police report. "But in your statement to police, you said he tried to access potentially harmful substances, not that he looked at a purse. Those are different things, aren't they?" Small inconsistencies emerged. The timeline shifted slightly. What Vanessa claimed Michael said versus what witnesses remembered. Each contradiction was minor by itself, But together they created a pattern of someone adjusting their story to sound more alarming than reality warranted. Carol's deposition was worse. Her attorney had clearly warned her to stay calm, but Carol had spent too many years being unquestioned in her authority to accept being challenged now. When Dana asked about her role in confirming Vanessa's allegations to police, Carol became defensive. "I was supporting my daughter who was trying to protect children. By confirming false allegations against your grandson. They weren't false. That boy was out of control." "Out of control? How?" Carol's face flushed. "Rebecca never learned to discipline properly. She raised him to think his feelings mattered more than respecting adults. He needed to be cut down to size before he became dangerous." Her lawyer touched her arm a warning, but Carol was already committed to the narrative she'd believed for so long. "Some people need to learn their place," she added. "Rebecca always thought she was better than everyone else." The stenographer's fingers flew across the keys, recording every word. "My own deposition came in month 17. Vanessa's attorney, trying to paint me as vindictive, asked pointed questions about my motivations for pursuing legal action. Isn't it true, Ms. Walsh, that you're doing this because you've always resented your sister?" "No," I said calmly. "I'm doing this because my 10-year-old son was handcuffed and traumatized based on lies." "But you've pursued this for over a year now. You've filed complaints, lawsuits gone after your family with remarkable persistence. Isn't that vindictive behavior?" I looked directly at him. "I've documented what happened and pursued appropriate legal channels. I'm making sure what happened to us has a cost high enough that it won't be easy for anyone to do it again." The room went quiet. Even the stenographer paused briefly before continuing to type. Dana later told me that response would be the centerpiece of our closing argument. When my mother's words about cutting me down to size were read back to her from the transcript, and she finally went silent, I knew the court wasn't the only place her power was shrinking. 20 months after police handcuffed my son at my mother's dinner table, we finally had our day in court. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined from television dramas. Wood paneling that had aged to a dark honey color, fluorescent lights that hummed quietly overhead rows of benches for observers. And at the front, Judge Elizabeth Morrison, presiding from an elevated bench. She was in her early 60s with steel gray hair and a reputation Dana had told me for cutting through nonsense to reach truth. Vanessa and Carol sat at the defense table with their attorney, a younger man named Peters, who'd taken over the case after their previous lawyer had quietly withdrawn. Peters had the tense posture of someone who knew he was defending a losing position, but was obligated to try. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Dana, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from shaking. The gallery wasn't full, but the people who'd come mattered. Mrs. Chen sat in the second row, having arranged her schedule to be there. A few neighbors I'd become friendly with over the past months occupied seats near the back. Several church members who'd witnessed Carol's fall from grace had come, some out of support for me, others perhaps out of morbid curiosity to see how the story would end. But the two people who surprised me most were the couple who approached me during the morning recess. The woman was in her mid-30s, holding her husband's hand tightly. "Ms. Walsh, I'm Sarah Patterson. This is my husband, Tom. We're Emma's parents." I'd known about Emma through documentation and case files, but seeing her mother's face, seeing the pain and gratitude mixed in her expression, made Emma real in a way she hadn't been before. "We heard about the licensing hearing," Sarah continued. "When we found out there was a trial, we wanted to be here. What your sister did to your son. We think she did something similar to our family. We just couldn't prove it the way you did." We spoke for only a few minutes before court resumed, but their presence in that courtroom added a weight to the proceedings that transcended my personal grievance. This wasn't just about my family anymore. Dana presented our case with the methodical precision we'd spent months preparing. She started with the body cam footage, playing it on a screen visible to the entire courtroom. Judge Morrison watched without expression as Vanessa performed her tearful report to police, then leaned forward slightly when the audio captured Vanessa's comment to Carol. "Maybe now she'll stop acting like she's better than us." Next came Michael's therapy records. Dr. Chen had prepared a comprehensive summary, clinical but devastating in its documentation of trauma. Then Dana read Michael's letter aloud, his 10-year-old handwriting projected on the screen. "I don't understand why loving my mom made me bad." The courtroom was very quiet. Dana moved through the CPS insider emails showing how Vanessa had received coaching on which protocols to trigger, which phrases would maintain institutional pressure. She presented the Emma Patterson case file. The teachers ignored warnings, the pattern of poor judgment followed by desperate overcorrection. Finally, she presented excerpts from the depositions. Carol's voice recorded and transcribed. Rebecca always needed to be cut down to size. Vanessa's contradictions about what Michael had actually done versus what she'd reported. Peters did his best with the defense. He argued family dispute, misunderstanding, the impossible pressures on mandated reporters who must make split-second decisions with children's safety at stake. Judge Morrison interrupted him. "Counselor, was it a split-second decision when your client documented concerns about her nephew for 3 weeks before calling police?" Peters stumbled. "She was monitoring an escalating situation. Or was it good faith when your client said on camera this would teach her sister a lesson?" Peters had no good answer. The judge took a brief recess to review exhibits, then returned to deliver her findings. In civil cases without juries, judges can render verdicts from the bench. "This case," Judge Morrison began, "represents a profound abuse of systems designed to protect the most vulnerable members of our society. Child Protective Services mandated reporting requirements. Police intervention protocols. These exist because children genuinely need protection from harm. When these systems are weaponized for personal vendettas, as the evidence clearly shows, happened here, the damage extends far beyond the immediate victims." She looked directly at Vanessa and Carol. "This court takes very seriously the misuse of legal and protective systems designed to help vulnerable children. When such systems are weaponized for personal vendettas, they harm not only the immediate victims, but erode public trust in these essential institutions. The evidence presented shows a pattern of malicious conduct, premeditation, and callous disregard for a child's well-being. Judge Morrison found in my favor on all counts. Defamation proven. Intentional infliction of emotional distress proven. Malicious abuse of process proven. Damages $150,000 from Vanessa, $100,000 from Carol, plus full attorney fees and costs. But more than the money which I knew they'd struggle to pay, the court record now contained formal findings. Michael was innocent. The accusations were false and malicious. Vanessa and Carol had acted with improper motives. It was official. It was permanent. It was truth acknowledged by an institution with the power to declare it. As the gavel came down and the judge's words about malicious misuse of authority echoed through the courtroom, I knew we'd finally force the world to see what they'd spent a lifetime hiding. The verdict was a victory, but Dana presented me with choices about what came next. "We could pursue criminal charges," she said in her office the week after trial. "Carol's embezzlement is documented. Vanessa's false reporting could be prosecuted. Jennifer Hastings at CPS certainly violated ethics codes, possibly laws about official misconduct." "What would that accomplish?" I asked. "Potentially jail time, criminal records, more public accountability." Dana paused. "But also years more litigation, more of Michael's childhood spent in legal proceedings, more energy focused backward instead of forward." I thought about Michael, now 11 years old, who'd spent nearly 2 years of his life shadowed by what Vanessa and Carol had done. He was healing slowly, but he was healing. Did I want to extend this fight? Or did I want to focus on building his future? "I want the settlement structured differently," I told Dana. "Not as payment to me, but as payment to Michael's future." We drafted terms that transformed punishment into provision. The $250,000 in damages would go directly into an irrevocable educational trust fund managed by an independent trustee. Not me, not anyone in the family, but a professional fiduciary whose sole obligation was to ensure those funds served Michael's educational needs. Carol would have to sell her house to pay her portion. She'd already listed it to cover the church and HOA restitution. Now those proceeds would go to her grandson's future instead of just repaying debts. Vanessa would liquidate assets, her SUV would be sold, her savings depleted. Every payment they made would be a reminder. Not a single event they could move past and forget, but an ongoing consequence that would take years to fully pay. But money wasn't enough. I needed them to face what they'd done in their own words. "I want written apologies," I told Dana. "Detailed, specific acknowledgments of what they did wrong. Not public, I don't need performative shame. Private letters that force them to articulate their actions without euphemism." Dana drafted the requirement into the settlement. Within 30 days, both Carol and Vanessa would provide written statements acknowledging specific actions, manipulating protective systems, making false statements to authorities, causing psychological harm to a child, for adult purposes, using institutional authority for personal vendettas. The letters arrived separately 4 weeks later. Carol's was 2 pages handwritten on her formal stationery. It acknowledged her role in confirming Vanessa's false allegations. It admitted she'd allowed personal feelings about me to cloud her judgment about Michael. It confessed to the embezzlement, framing it as poor financial boundaries, but at least naming it. The tone was defensive, even an apology full of justifications, but the facts were there in her own hand. Vanessa's letter was longer, more detailed. She acknowledged creating a false narrative about Michael. She admitted the Emma Patterson case had influenced her actions. She confessed to coordinating with Jennifer Hastings to maintain CPS pressure. Her letter ended, "I know this doesn't undo the harm. I know you'll never forgive me. I'm writing this because I need to see in my own handwriting what I became." I read both letters once, then placed them in a file folder labeled Settlement Documentation. I didn't respond to either. The point wasn't to grant absolution or continue dialogue. The point was forcing them to confront their actions in permanent form, to write down truths they'd spent months denying. The final settlement provision was the one Carol fought hardest against: strict no contact with Michael until he turned 18 and could decide for himself whether to have a relationship with them. No birthday cards, no Christmas gifts, no showing up at school events or sports games. No indirect contact through relatives. Any violation would trigger additional financial penalties, $5,000 per incident. Carol's lawyer called Dana. "This is unnecessarily cruel. Mrs. Walsh is his grandmother. You're preventing her from having any relationship with her grandson." Dana's response, which I'd crafted word for word, was simple. Mrs. Walsh had the chance to be a grandmother. She chose to be his accuser instead. Michael deserves protection from people who hurt him, even if they're related by blood. When he's 18, he can decide if he wants contact. Until then, he gets to heal without them. Signing the settlement that turned their pride into my son's future felt less like mercy and more like justice with interest. 6 weeks after the settlement was finalized, Carol's attorney called Dana with a request. Carol wanted to meet with me privately, claiming she wanted to apologize properly and make things right before it's too late. Dana advised against it. "You don't owe her anything. The settlement is done. You can say no." But I was curious. After everything, the trial, the verdict, the forced apology letter, what could Carol possibly think she could make, right? "I'll meet her," I said. "But in public, and you'll be there." We met at a coffee shop on a weekday afternoon, neutral territory, with other customers providing witnesses. Dana sat at a corner table with her laptop, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough to give the illusion of privacy. Carol arrived 10 minutes late, thinner than I'd seen her in years. She'd sold her house to make the settlement payments, and I knew from my aunt that she was now living in a small apartment on the south side of town. The church community she'd spent decades cultivating had largely scattered, some because of the embezzlement, others simply uncomfortable with the whole mess. She ordered nothing, just sat down across from me with her purse clutched in her lap. "Thank you for coming," she said stiffly. "You said you wanted to apologize." I'm sorry you felt hurt by everything that happened, she began, and I almost stood up right then. Not, I'm sorry I hurt you, but I'm sorry you felt hurt. The apology that wasn't an apology that placed responsibility on my feelings, rather than her actions. Is that what you wanted to say? I asked. I wanted you to know that this whole situation has been blown out of proportion. It was a family disagreement that got out of hand. We all made mistakes. We didn't all make mistakes, Mom. You and Vanessa made choices. Deliberate, calculated choices to hurt a child. Carol's face tightened. You're determined to paint yourself as a victim. I was a victim, I said calmly. And so was Michael. But we're not anymore because we chose to stop letting you hurt us. I leaned forward, deciding that after everything Carol deserved to hear, a truth she'd spent decades avoiding. Do you know what I learned from your deposition about the CPS case from when I was 8 years old? Carol's expression flickered the first real emotion I'd seen from her. You abused Vanessa through neglect when she was 4. You were addicted to prescription pills. You left a preschooler in the care of an 8-year-old child. And when CPS investigated, you blamed me to cover yourself. Then you spent 30 years overcompensating with Vanessa while treating me like I was the problem. Your favoritism wasn't love, Mom. It was guilt. And you made us both pay for it. Carol's face cycled through shock, denial, anger. I was sick. I didn't know what I was doing. It was a different time. You were sick, I interrupted. You probably still are, but you're no longer my mother in any way that matters. You don't get to hurt me anymore, and you don't get to know my son. That's not punishment, it's protection. I stood to leave. Dana had already packed up her laptop ready. I did my best, Carol called after me, her voice cracking. I paused at the door, looked back at her one last time. Your best destroyed people, Mom. That's not something to be proud of. Walking away from my mother for the last time, I felt lighter, not because she finally understood, but because I finally accepted she never would. A month after my final meeting with Carol, Vanessa's attorney contacted Dana with a different kind of request. Vanessa wanted to meet not about the settlement that was finalized, but about the licensing board investigation. We met in Dana's office this time. Vanessa looked exhausted in a way that makeup couldn't hide. Her license had been suspended for 5 months now. She wasn't working. I knew from mutual acquaintances that her marriage was strained, that she was struggling financially, that the public nature of everything had isolated her. Thank you for meeting with me, she said, her voice subdued. I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I'm begging you, please withdraw the Emma Patterson complaint from the licensing board. I said nothing, just waited. My license is suspended, not revoked. If the board investigates the Emma case fully, it will be permanent. I'll never work in counseling again. But if you withdraw that part, there's a chance for reinstatement in a few years. I'm in therapy now. I'm learning about the mistakes I made. I'll never work with children again if that's what it takes. I'll switch to adult counseling. Just please don't make Emma part of my permanent record. I already submitted the full report, I said. It's not about you anymore, Vanessa. It's about Emma and any future child who might be in danger from someone with your pattern of judgment. The board needs to know that you missed real danger and then created fake danger. That's not a one-time mistake, that's a pattern that put children at risk. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. I know what I did was wrong. I know I can't undo it. But my whole life is falling apart. I'm genuinely sorry your life is hard right now, I said and meant it. But my son's life was hard when he was handcuffed at 10 years old. Some consequences can't be undone. Before she could respond, I decided she deserved to know one more truth. Vanessa, I learned something from Mom's deposition, about when you were 4 years old. I told her about Carol's prescription pill addiction, the neglect, the CPS investigation that Carol had manipulated by blaming 8-year-old me. I watched my sister's face as her entire understanding of our childhood rearranged itself. She never loved me more, Vanessa whispered. She just felt guilty. Yes. Everything I thought about being special, being chosen, it was just her trying to make up for failing me first. Yes. For a moment, we looked at each other across Dana's desk and saw the same thing, two daughters damaged by the same broken woman caught in patterns neither of us had chosen, but both of us had perpetuated. We were both victims, Vanessa said softly. We were, I agreed. But you made choices that turned you into something else. And I can't let those choices be consequence-free just because we share wounds. Vanessa nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, Rebecca. I'm truly, genuinely sorry for what I did to Michael. To you. It was the first time she'd apologized without qualification, without excuse. My sister whispered, I'm sorry, with genuine tears for the first time. But sorry doesn't undo handcuffs, doesn't erase nightmares, doesn't rebuild trust, it just acknowledges what's been broken beyond repair. 3 years passed. Michael turned 13 in the spring, and I watched him blow out candles surrounded by friends from school, from robotics club, from the neighborhood. Real friends who knew nothing about handcuffs or police cars or family betrayal. They knew him as the kid who was brilliant with circuit boards and terrible at basketball and could make anyone laugh with his dry observations about their science teacher. The trust fund sat quietly in an account managed by professionals, growing steadily. By the time Michael graduated high school, it would cover 4 years of college at any state school or a significant portion of tuition at a private university. Every month, payments came in from Vanessa and Carol, court-ordered deposits that would continue for years. Their punishment was ongoing, a reminder written in bank statements and budget constraints. Michael still saw Dr. Chen occasionally, though. The appointments had shifted from twice weekly to once a month, then to every few months as needed. He'd processed the trauma as much as a child could, understanding that what happened to him wasn't his fault, that the adults who should have protected him had failed, that healing was possible even when scars remained. He still tensed sometimes when police cars passed with sirens on, still had moments of anxiety about being separated from me. But these were manageable now, understood, integrated into his awareness, rather than controlling him. One evening, while doing homework at the kitchen table, he asked, Mom, those letters Grandma Carol and Aunt Vanessa had to write, can I read them? I set down the financial report I'd been reviewing for a client. When you're 18 and ready, yes. But Michael, they're not going to make you feel better or give you closure. They're just acknowledgments of what happened. I know, he said. I don't want to read them now, I just wanted to know if I could, that it's my choice. Always your choice, I promised. I won't use the past to control your future. What you do with those letters, whether you ever want contact with them again, that's entirely up to you. He nodded and returned to his algebra homework satisfied. While Michael healed, I found new purpose. Dana connected me with a legal aid organization that helped families navigating CPS investigations. I started volunteering 2 afternoons a week, teaching workshops for single mothers who were facing what I'd faced: the fear, the institutional bias, the feeling of powerlessness against systems designed to protect children but sometimes weaponized against families. I taught practical skills: how to document everything, dates, times, exact quotes, how to request records, how to find trustworthy advocates, how to know your rights without antagonizing caseworkers, how to distinguish between compliance and capitulation, how to stop confusing silence with peace. Several women told me I'd saved their families. One called me her lifeline, the person who helped her understand she wasn't crazy, wasn't alone, wasn't powerless. I also worked with the county CPS director on internal reforms. My case, anonymized, became part of their training curriculum about recognizing false reports, identifying conflicts of interest in mandated reporting, and understanding how professional credentials can be misused. The changes were small but meaningful. Better documentation requirements. Second-level review for reports involving family members of the reporter, stricter protocols for caseworker communications with reporters. A week before Michael's 13th birthday, a letter arrived. Not from Carol, but from Vanessa. I almost didn't open it, but something made me slide my finger under the envelope flap. The letter wasn't long, Vanessa wrote that she'd spent 3 years in therapy trying to understand how she'd become someone willing to hurt a child to save her career. She didn't ask for forgiveness or suggest contact. She simply wanted me to know that our fight had created changes beyond our family. Emma Patterson's parents had sued the school district, and the case had resulted in new protocols for handling teacher concerns about student welfare. CPS had tightened their review processes for mandated reporter conflicts of interest. The licensing board had updated ethics training for school counselors. "I know this doesn't matter to you," Vanessa wrote, "but you should know your fight protected other kids. I'm sorry it took your son's pain to make that happen." I filed the letter away without responding. She was right, it didn't change what she'd done. But it did confirm something I'd come to understand: our story had become bigger than our wounds. That weekend, we hosted a neighborhood barbecue in our backyard. Dana came with her partner, both of them chasing their toddler around the grass. Dr. Chen and her husband brought dessert. Mrs. Chen, who'd been watching Michael since he was small, sat in a lawn chair directing traffic. Neighbors who'd become genuine friends over the years filled the yard with conversation and laughter. Michael played frisbee with his friends under the oak tree, his face open and carefree in a way it hadn't been 3 years ago. Watching him, I understood what we'd really built through all of this. Not the family I was born into, but the family I chose to protect. Not silence and survival, but voice and boundaries. Not shame passed down through generations, but strength grown from surviving it. They'd called Michael a destructive brat and treated me like the disposable daughter. But watching him step into a future built on truth instead of fear, I finally understood their real family isn't the one she came from, it's the one she chose to protect. My phone buzzed with an email from a national child welfare organization asking permission to use my case study for a conference on protecting families from system abuse. I typed one word: approved. They once tried to take everything from us using the very systems meant to protect children, but in the end we didn't just survive their betrayal. We transformed it into something that would protect children they'd never meet in places they'd never know, for years they'd never see. Rebecca's story reminds us that sometimes the hardest battles we fight aren't against strangers, but against the people who were supposed to love us most. It shows us that silence isn't the same as peace. That protecting our children sometimes means standing up to our own family, and that justice, real justice, takes time, patience, and the courage to document truth even when the world isn't ready to hear it. What struck me most about this journey was how Rebecca transformed her pain into protection for others. She didn't just win her case and walk away. She changed systems. She mentored other mothers. She turned her son's trauma into training that would help caseworkers recognize when protective systems are being weaponized. That's not just revenge. That's legacy. If this story resonated with you, if it made you angry or inspired, or gave you hope that truth can prevail even when the odds seem impossible, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to stand up to family to protect yourself or your children? Have you witnessed someone weaponize systems meant to help people? What would you have done in Rebecca's position? Your stories and perspectives matter, and this community is built on sharing experiences that help us all feel less alone. If you found value in this story, please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the stories of people who refused to stay silent, who fought back with intelligence and courage, and who proved that being underestimated can be your greatest advantage. Every subscription helps these stories reach more people who need to hear them. And if you know someone who's going through something similar, someone fighting against false accusations, navigating CPS, standing up to toxic family dynamics, please share this video with them. Sometimes knowing that someone else survived the same battle and came out stronger is the lifeline that keeps us going. Thank you for listening to Rebecca and Michael's story. Thank you for being part of a community that believes survivors, celebrates resilience, and understands that the family we choose is just as important as the family we're born into. Until next time, remember, your voice matters, your truth matters, and you deserve to be protected, not silenced.